Hey, welcome back, friend. Pull up whatever you sleep with tonight, a blanket, a pillow, maybe a cat who has already claimed the warmest spot, and get yourself properly settled, because tonight we're talking about what life was really like for the elite in ancient Greece. Specifically, we're spending this evening inside the home of a wealthy woman in Athens, in the years when the Parthenon was still new and pale and almost shockingly white against the sky. Before we step inside, if these slow journeys into the past are the kind of thing that helps you drift off, it would mean a lot if you hit subscribe and left the video a like. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you're tucked in tonight and what time it is where you are. I read those more than you'd think. Now here's where I want to start, because I think it's going to surprise you. In classical Athens, a woman was never legally a citizen of her own city, not even if her father, her husband and her sons all were. She could not, in most circumstances, own land in her own name. She was typically married around the age of 14 or 15, often to a man more than twice her age. Her actual name, the one her parents gave her, was something a respectable family tried never to say aloud in front of strangers, not in life, and barely even after death. And here's the part that tends to catch people off guard. The wealthier she was, the less of her own city she was permitted to see with her own eyes. Sit with that for a second, because it cuts against almost everything we assume about money and freedom. We tend to think wealth opens doors. We think it buys movement, access, the wide world. In the household we're about to step into tonight, wealth did something close to the opposite. It built walls. Beautiful ones, certainly, painted and columned and fragrant with imported oil, but walls all the same. So dim the light if you can. Let's go back about 2,400 years to a city of dust and white stone and olive trees, and let's meet a woman. We don't know her real name because, as I just said, we were never really meant to. So let's call her Melita, which means honeybee, and which was, as it happens, a genuinely common name for ordinary Athenian girls of her time. Not a princess. Not a figure from myth. Just a woman, the wife of a citizen with land and ships and silver. The kind of household that history quietly assumed didn't need its women to be remembered by name, only by reputation. It is sometime in the later years of the 5th century before our era, and the sun has not yet fully cleared the rooftops of Athens. Picture the house first, because the house tells you almost everything. From the street, it would not impress you. Athenian houses, even wealthy ones, presented blank, almost offensive faces to the road. A plain mud brick or rubble wall, whitewashed sometimes not even that, with a single narrow door set into it. No windows looking out onto the street, or at most a few small, high shuttered openings that let in light but not eyes. If you walked past it on your way to the Agora, you would have no idea that inside the floor of the courtyard was swept 3 times a day, that the dining room had painted plaster walls, that there were more silver cups in one cupboard than most families in the city would see in a lifetime. This was deliberate. The wealth of an Athenian household was not meant to announce itself to the street. It announced itself inward, to guests who were invited past that plain door, and even then, only to a point. Because past that door was a small entryway, and past the entryway was a courtyard open to the sky, and ringed around that courtyard were the rooms of the house, arranged according to a logic that had almost nothing to do with comfort, and almost everything to do with who was allowed to see whom. Here is the detail that I think genuinely deserves a moment of pause. In a wealthy Athenian home, the rooms nearest the front door, nearest the street, nearest where male guests would be received, were for men. There was often a room called the andron, the men's room, sometimes raised slightly on a low platform, fitted with couches along the walls where men reclined to eat and drink and talk long into the night. It tended to be one of the most lavishly decorated rooms in the house, because it was the room outsiders actually saw. And then, further back, often up a narrow stair, sometimes simply deeper into the building's interior, away from the entrance, away from the andron, away from any unrelated man who might wander in, were the women's rooms, the gynekonitis, the gynekaion, whichever term a given source uses. This was Melita's domain, and also, in a way that takes some sitting with, her boundary. She wakes, in our story, before most of the household, though not before the household slaves, who have already been awake for some time tending the hearth fire, which in a world without matches was not something you let go out carelessly overnight. The room is dim. Athenian houses use small high windows, if they had windows in that part of the house at all, more for ventilation than for view, and so the light that reaches her is soft, filtered, almost grey, until the sun climbs higher. She doesn't dress herself, not entirely, not in the way we'd picture. There is a slave girl, perhaps young, perhaps a girl bought as a child from a market that dealt in such things without much ceremony, whose job among others is to help Melita into her clothes for the day. We'll come back to that relationship because it's more complicated and more human than it first appears, and I don't want to rush past it. But for now, just hold the image. A woman getting dressed in a dim room, with help, behind walls specifically built so that the act of her getting dressed, the act of her simply existing in daylight with her hair undone, would never be witnessed by anyone outside her own household. Let's talk about why, because the why is where this story actually starts to open up. Athenian thinking about respectable women rested on an idea that doesn't translate easily into how most of us live now. The idea was roughly this: a woman's worth, her arete, her excellence as a wife, was measured partly by how invisible she managed to be. Not invisible in the sense of being ignored within her own household, where she ran a great deal, but invisible to the world outside it. The historian Thucydides records a funeral speech attributed to the statesman Pericles, delivered for the Athenian dead of a war, in which he turns briefly to address the widows in the crowd, and the gist of what he tells them, paraphrasing rather than quoting directly, is that a woman's greatest honour lies in being talked about by men as little as possible, whether the talk is good or bad. Sit with how strange that piece of praise actually is. The highest compliment available to a citizen's wife was silence. Not modesty exactly, though that was part of it. Absence. Unremarkableness. To be so thoroughly unseen that no one outside her own walls had anything to say about her at all. And this wasn't a fringe opinion held by one cranky statesman at one funeral. It threaded through how Athenian houses were built, how marriages were arranged, how festivals were organised, even how the comic playwrights of the city joked about women, because you can usually tell what a culture takes for granted by what it finds funny. Aristophanes wrote an entire comedy, Lysistrata, built on the premise that women seizing public political power was so far outside the realm of the imaginable that it played as outrageous farce, women storming the treasury, women organising a citywide strike, women suddenly visible and vocal in a way that the audience understood, instinctively, as the world turned upside down. So, here is Melita, in her dim upper room, about to begin a day that, by the standards of her own culture, is going extraordinarily well for her. She is wealthy, she is healthy, she has, we'll say, already given her husband a son, which matters more than almost anything else we're going to discuss tonight. She wants for nothing material, and she will, in all likelihood, leave this house perhaps a handful of times this entire month, for reasons her culture considers acceptable: a religious festival, a visit to close female relatives, a funeral, the Agora, the open marketplace where the actual life and gossip and commerce of Athens churns every single day, the place where her husband almost certainly will spend hours of this very afternoon, is essentially closed to her. Not by law exactly. Athenian law on this point is murkier than people sometimes assume, but by custom so heavy it functioned as law. A respectable woman of means simply did not go to market herself. She sent someone, usually a slave. There's a wry little irony buried in all of this that the sources themselves seem to have half noticed. The poorer a woman was, the more of the city she actually got to see. A poor citizen's wife, or the wife of a metic, a resident foreigner, might genuinely have to walk to the public fountain house herself to fetch water, might have to sell vegetables or woven goods in a corner of the Agora, might work alongside men in a way no wealthy woman ever would, because her family simply couldn't afford the alternative. Wealth, for a woman in this world, didn't buy access to the city. It bought permission to disappear from it. I find that detail hard to shake, honestly. We tend to imagine the past as a kind of ladder, where climbing higher means seeing more, doing more, being more free. And for the men of this story, that's basically true. For the women, the ladder ran in the opposite direction. Let's keep walking through Melita's morning, because the texture of it tells you things no list of facts ever quite manages to. Once she's dressed, simply for now, we'll get to the elaborate version later in the day, she moves into the part of her morning that almost every source agrees was the actual occupation of a respectable Athenian woman, rich or otherwise: woolwork, spinning, weaving, the production of cloth. This might sound, on the surface, like manual labour incompatible with the picture I've just painted of seclusion and luxury, and that's exactly the contradiction worth slowing down on. Because in Athenian moral thinking, woolwork wasn't beneath a wealthy woman. It was, if anything, the proof of her virtue. Greek funerary inscriptions for women, the little epitaphs carved on gravestones that have survived in the hundreds, return again and again to the same handful of compliments. She was a good wife. She loved her children. She was skilled at the loom. That last one shows up so often it starts to feel less like a personal observation and more like a formula, a box that needed checking, the female equivalent of praising a man for his courage in battle or his service to the city. So in Melita's house there is almost certainly a room, or at least a corner of the courtyard with good light, set up for exactly this: a standing loom, the kind Greeks called a warp-weighted loom, tall wooden beams with rows of hanging clay weights at the bottom holding the vertical threads taut, a basket nearby with wool, raw, unspun, smelling faintly of lanolin and whatever pasture it came from, a distaff and spindle for spinning that raw wool into thread, a task simple enough in mechanics. You draw the fibre out with your fingers while the spindle drops and twists it, but demanding enough in practiced skill that a woman might spend literal years of her life at it, hour after hour, almost without noticing the hours pass. Now here's the part that I think actually matters most, and it's easy to miss. A wealthy woman like Melita probably didn't spin every thread of cloth her household used with her own two hands. She had slaves for that, several of them likely, women whose entire function within the household was textile production, spinning and carding and weaving from dawn until the light failed. What Melita herself did, what her social position actually demanded of her, was something closer to supervision, quality control, and, crucially, the finer decorative work, the intricate border pattern on a himation, the careful weaving of a particular design meant for a special occasion. These were sometimes reserved for the mistress of the house specifically, because doing them with her own hands was itself a display of skill, almost an art form, performed for an audience of exactly nobody outside her own family. That's worth pausing on. Imagine spending hours perfecting a woven pattern that essentially no one beyond your own household will ever see you create. The labour is real, the skill is real, the audience by design is almost non-existent, and yet this work mattered enormously to the household's actual economy. We tend to think of ancient elite households as simply consuming wealth that flowed in from land or trade, but a huge percentage of a Greek family's everyday textile needs, clothing, blankets, bedding, were produced internally inside that walled courtyard by the women and the female slaves of the house. Xenophon, an Athenian writer of the period whose treatise on household management, the O Economicus, survives more or less intact, has his idealized husband explain to his very young new wife exactly this division of labor. The husband's job, as Xenophon frames it, is to bring resources into the house from the outside world. The wife's job is to manage and increase what comes in, to keep it organized, productive, and not wasted, a kind of indoor general commanding her own small, devoted, and entirely unfree army. I want to come back to Xenophon in a little while, because that treatise gives us one of the strangest and most vivid windows we have into what an actual marriage conversation might have sounded like. A husband explaining to a wife who was likely not yet 15 years old exactly what her function in his life was now supposed to be. But let's stay with the morning a little longer first. While Melita works or oversees the work or moves between the two depending on the day, the rest of the household has its own rhythm happening around her. Slaves move through the courtyard with water jars. Someone is grinding grain. a task so constant in ancient households that the sound of the grinding stone, a low repetitive scrape, was probably one of the most familiar background noises of her entire life, present from childhood until old age, never really stopping. There's a fire being tended in a hearth somewhere, because fire in this world is not a switch you flip, it's a living thing you keep alive, feed, bank at night, and coax back the next morning, the same way we saw in households 1,000 years apart and a continent away, because some problems of pre-industrial life are simply universal. Let's talk numbers for a moment, because I think they help anchor just how unusual Melita's situation actually was compared to most people living in the same city at the same time. A skilled labourer in classical Athens, the kind of man who might work on a public building project, earned roughly a drachma a day. We know this with reasonable confidence because the Athenians, with a bureaucratic thoroughness that frankly puts a lot of later civilizations to shame, carved their public building accounts directly into stone, and some of those accounts for projects on the Acropolis itself have survived. The drachma a day, 6 obols, was a working wage, not a wealthy one. From that, a man had to feed himself and often a family. A household slave, by contrast, the kind of person who might spend her entire adult life spinning wool in Melita's courtyard, could be purchased for somewhere in the rough range of 1 to 300 drachmas, depending heavily on her age, her skills, and frankly the whims of the market on a given day. We have a genuinely remarkable source for this, a set of inscriptions known to historians as the Attic Stele, public records from the year 414 before our era listing the confiscated property of men condemned for religious crimes, property that included, with the same bureaucratic flatness used for furniture and farm animals, lists of enslaved people and the prices they fetched. The range across those records runs roughly from the low hundreds down into double digits for the least valued individuals, with skilled or trained slaves, a cook, a craftsman, fetching considerably more. A dowry, the money or property a bride's family handed over to the husband's household at marriage, technically to be held in trust for her and returned if the marriage ended, could for a family like Melita's run into the thousands of drachmas. Wealthy Athenian families sometimes spoke of dowries in terms of talents rather than drachmas, and a single talent was worth 6,000 drachmas, which, if you're doing the mental math against that drachma day wage, represents something like 20 years of a skilled labourer's entire income handed over at once as essentially the price of admission for a 14-year-old girl into a household that already had everything. I find myself returning to that number more than I expected to when I first started researching tonight's story. 20 years of wages for one marriage, and the bride herself, the actual human being at the centre of that transaction, had essentially no say in the negotiation that produced it. Let's go back to Melita's morning, because I don't want to leave her sitting at the loom indefinitely while we talk economics. By mid-morning, a female relative might come to visit, a sister, an aunt, a friend from a similarly situated household nearby. This was one of the genuinely sanctioned ways an Athenian woman maintained a social life. Visits between women's quarters, conducted with the household slaves managing the actual logistics of who came and went through that narrow street door. These visits weren't trivial. They were, by several accounts, where an enormous amount of the actual information network of the city flowed, who had married whom, whose dowry negotiations had collapsed, which household was rumoured to be in financial trouble, which young man had embarrassed his family at the symposium last week. Men gossiped in the Agora and the gymnasium. Women gossiped behind those high courtyard walls. And honestly, given how thoroughly Athenian comedy depends on the assumption that wives know everything happening in their own neighbourhoods, I suspect the women's network was, if anything, the more efficient one. There's a particular kind of intimacy in these visits that's worth dwelling on, because it's one of the only places in Melita's day where she might actually speak freely, without the careful, managed performance that defines so much of the rest of her existence. Among other respectable wives, behind closed doors, in rooms where no male guest would ever wander, there was room for actual conversation, actual complaint, actual laughter, that didn't need to be modulated for anyone's benefit but her own. Now let's talk about what happens to her physical appearance over the course of this day, because this is where things get genuinely fascinating and a little uncomfortable, and occasionally both at once. If there's an occasion that afternoon or evening, a festival, a visit from her husband's important business associates, a religious obligation, Melita will go through a beauty routine that in its broad shape would feel oddly recognizable to a woman getting ready for an evening out 24 centuries later, even though the specific tools and substances involved are almost uniformly things we would now consider mildly horrifying. She has a mirror, polished bronze rather than silvered glass, because clear glass mirrors as we'd recognize them didn't exist yet. Bronze buffed to a high enough shine gives back a usable reflection, though slightly warm-toned and never quite as crisp as what we're used to. Hers might have a decorated handle, perhaps shaped like a standing female figure, the kind of object that survives in museum collections today specifically because it was valuable enough to be buried with its owner or tucked into a dowry chest and forgotten. For her face, the fashionable standard of the period, at least among women whose families could afford to chase fashionable standards, called for skin as pale as possible. Pale skin signaled, the same way it would centuries later in entirely different parts of the world, that you didn't labour outdoors, that you didn't need to achieve it. Women applied a white substance called sumithion, white lead, mixed into a paste and spread over the face and sometimes the neck and arms. I want to be straightforward with you about what this actually was, because it's one of those facts about the ancient world that tends to land hard once you really sit with it. Lead is toxic. The Greeks didn't understand the mechanism, obviously. Germ theory and toxicology were both many centuries away, but some ancient medical writers did notice, in vague and unsystematic ways, that women who used white lead cosmetics heavily over long periods sometimes developed health problems, paleness beyond the cosmetic kind, digestive trouble, in some accounts a kind of creeping fatigue. We don't have, and probably never will have, hard data on how widespread the actual harm was, but the substance itself by any modern measure was genuinely dangerous, and women used it anyway for the same reason women in 19th century England later used arsenic wafers and lead-based face powder for that same fashionable pallor. The pressure to meet a beauty standard has, across an extraordinary range of cultures and centuries, repeatedly proven strong enough to override fairly serious risk to the body producing the effect. Colour came next, applied sparingly, usually to the cheeks, sometimes from a plant-derived red dye like alkanet root, sometimes from other substances historians are honestly less certain about, since the written sources are frustratingly vague about exact recipes, the kind of household knowledge passed down by demonstration rather than recorded in any text that survived. For the eyes, soot or a mineral substance was used to darken the lash line and define the brow. And here's a small detail I genuinely love, because it tells you something about how differently beauty standards can land across time. In several periods of ancient Greek culture, a single unbroken eyebrow line across the forehead, rather than two separate brows, was considered attractive, a mark of refined beauty rather than something to pluck apart. Some women who weren't naturally blessed with brows that met in the middle apparently used a darkening substance to fill in the gap and fake the unified look. I want to be honest that the specific evidence for exactly how widespread this was, and in precisely which decades of which Greek city it peaked, is debated among classicists. The sources are scattered across centuries and regions and don't all agree neatly. But the basic idea, women artificially darkening the space between their eyebrows to achieve a look we would now spend considerable money plucking away, has stuck with me since I first read about it, because it's such a clean little reminder that beauty is a moving target, never a fixed truth, just whatever a given culture has decided to want this century. Her hair gets attention too, and this is where status really shows itself, because hairstyling in this world was time-consuming, skilled labour, almost always performed by someone else's hands. A slave trained in the work, or simply practiced through years of doing it daily, would arrange Melita's hair, perhaps in a style with the front sections drawn back and the rest gathered and bound, perhaps held with a fillet, a simple cloth or ribbon band called a tania, or for a married woman, sometimes covered partially by a fabric hairnet called a sakos. Married women generally wore their hair up and at least partially covered, in contrast to unmarried girls, who were permitted to wear theirs loose and longer, the hairstyle itself functioning almost like a public announcement of marital status before a single word was exchanged. Perfume comes last, and this is genuinely one of the more luxurious corners of Melita's world, because scented oil in Athens was an import economy in miniature. Olive oil itself was local and cheap, the base of essentially everything: cooking, lighting lamps, bathing. But scented oil infused with myrrh or frankincense from Arabia, with cinnamon or spikenard carried along trade routes that stretched, link by link, hand by hand, ship by ship, all the way back toward the edges of what Greeks even knew existed, was genuinely expensive, stored in small decorated vessels, alabastra carved from real alabaster for the wealthiest households, or simpler clay versions for everyone else. A vial of good imported perfume could cost what a labourer earned in days, sometimes weeks, depending on quality and rarity. And Melita, behind her courtyard walls, almost never seen by anyone outside her own household and her closest female relatives, wore it anyway. That's worth sitting with for a second. The most expensive, most carefully imported, most luxuriously scented substances in her entire daily routine were largely experienced by an audience of nobody, or near enough to nobody, that it amounts to the same thing. The luxury wasn't performance for the world. It was, in a strange way, performance for the household itself, for her husband, for visiting female relatives, for the gods at festival time, and perhaps, in whatever private way we can never fully access from this distance, simply for herself. I keep coming back to that thought, honestly. We tend to assume that luxury by definition needs witnesses. Melita's luxury mostly didn't have any, and yet it existed anyway, applied with real care, every single time there was occasion for it. Now let's talk about clothing, because this is where the economics of being a wealthy Athenian woman get genuinely striking, in ways that connect directly back to those drachma figures we touched on earlier. The basic garment for an Athenian woman of this period was either a peplos, a simple rectangular piece of heavier woolen fabric folded over and pinned at the shoulders, or, increasingly common by Melita's time, a chiton, a lighter garment, sometimes linen, that could be pinned along the arm to create sleeves of a sort, belted at the waist, draped in folds that Greek sculptors spent literal centuries trying to capture convincingly in marble. Over either, when going outdoors or in cooler weather, a himation, a large rectangular wrap thrown over one shoulder and around the body, functioning as both cloak and frankly as a kind of mobile privacy screen, something a woman could pull up over her head if she did happen to step outside and wanted to obscure her face from passing strangers. The fabric itself tells a quiet story about wealth. Undyed wool, the natural cream or light brown colour of the fleece, was the affordable default, worn by households across the economic spectrum. Linen, imported or grown locally depending on the region and period, tended to run a notch more expensive, valued for its lighter weight and the way it draped, especially useful in the Athenian summer heat. But dyed cloth, that's where the real money entered the picture. Saffron yellow was a popular and visible colour, achieved with crocus-derived dye that itself wasn't cheap, since it took an enormous number of tiny flower stigmas to produce even a modest quantity of usable pigment. Deep reds were achievable through various plant and insect-based dyes, but the genuinely jaw-dropping expense, the one that historians still talk about with a kind of disbelieving respect, was purple, the dye later famous as Tyrian purple, extracted from the glandular secretion of a particular species of sea snail along the coasts of the eastern Mediterranean. Here's the number that tends to stop people. Producing even a small quantity of usable purple dye required harvesting and processing thousands upon thousands of individual snails, an almost incomprehensible amount of labour for what amounted to, by weight, a substance that could genuinely cost more than gold. Because of this, true purple cloth was almost never used for an entire garment, even among the wealthiest households in Athens. It appeared instead as trim, a border along the edge of a himation, a decorative band on a hem, a small deliberate flash of colour that announced, to anyone close enough to notice, that this family could afford something most families in the entire ancient Mediterranean world simply could not. Melita, on a day with real occasion, might wear a himation with exactly this kind of purple border, dyed wool beneath it, fine linen against her skin, gold pins at the shoulders rather than the simple bronze ones used for everyday wear, and over all of it, that careful, time-consuming application of cosmetics and scent we just walked through. The total value of what she's wearing on her body, fabric, dye, pins, jewellery, would represent, in raw economic terms, more than many households in the same city would see pass through their hands across an entire year, and she would wear it, in all likelihood, almost entirely within walls that the general public of Athens would never see past. Jewellery deserves its own moment here, because Athenian goldwork from this broad period, when you actually look at surviving examples in museum collections, is extraordinary. Earrings worked in fine gold wire and tiny granulated beads, sometimes shaped as miniature animal heads or rosettes. Necklaces with pendant beads of gold, sometimes set with semi-precious stones, carnelian, garnet. Occasionally even pieces incorporating amber traded down from far northern coastlines, through chains of intermediaries that none of the people wearing the final product could have traced. Bracelets, often in spiral or coiled forms. Rings, sometimes set with carved gemstone seals that doubled as a kind of personal signature, pressed into wax to mark a letter or a storage jar as belonging to a particular household. A wealthy Athenian woman's jewellery collection, kept in a wooden chest somewhere in her quarters, watched over carefully, often by a trusted slave whose entire function was managing exactly this kind of household treasure, represented a meaningful chunk of the family's portable liquid wealth. Land couldn't be quickly converted to cash. Gold jewellery could. There's something almost practical buried inside all that ornamentation, beneath the aesthetic pleasure of it. It was beauty, yes, but it was also quietly a small private treasury worn on the body of a woman who herself could not legally own property, carrying around her neck and wrists wealth that, on paper, technically belonged to her husband or her father. That contradiction sat at the centre of so much of Melita's material life, honestly. She was surrounded by, dressed in, perfumed with, and adorned by genuine wealth, real luxury by any standard of her era. And almost none of it, in the strict legal sense, was hers. Let's actually sit with that legal reality for a moment, because I think it's the piece that makes everything else make sense. Under Athenian law, a woman existed under the authority of a kyrios, a guardian, for essentially her entire life. As a girl, this was her father. At marriage, it transferred to her husband. If she became a widow, depending on circumstances, it might pass to a son, or back to her father's household, or to another male relative. She could not generally initiate major legal or financial transactions on her own. She could not vote, obviously, since voting in the Athenian assembly was restricted to adult male citizens, but she also could not, in the great majority of circumstances, independently buy or sell significant property, bring most kinds of lawsuits in her own name, or serve on juries, all of which were core activities of Athenian civic life that we tend to associate when we picture Athenian democracy in our heads with the city as a whole, rather than recognizing that the whole thing operated on a citizenry that by strict legal definition was entirely male. This wasn't simply oversight or accident, it was structural, built into how Athenians understood the household, the oikos, as the basic unit of the city. The oikos needed continuity, needed legitimate heirs, needed property to pass cleanly from generation to generation, and Athenian law constructed an elaborate set of rules around marriage, inheritance, and a woman's legal status specifically to protect that continuity, with the woman herself functioning, in the cold language of the system, less as an independent legal actor and more as the vessel through which legitimate citizenship and property passed from one generation of men to the next. There's a particularly vivid illustration of this in Athenian inheritance law involving something called the epikleros, the heiress. If a citizen died leaving no sons, only a daughter, that daughter became in a sense the carrier of the family's entire estate. But Athenian law didn't simply let her inherit and control it freely. Instead, she was generally required to marry her nearest eligible male relative, sometimes an uncle decades older than her, specifically to keep the property within the bloodline and under male management. We know from surviving legal speeches, the kind written for delivery in Athenian courts by professional speechwriters and preserved because they were later studied as models of rhetoric, that this could mean a man already married was expected to divorce his existing wife in order to marry a young female relative who had suddenly become an heiress, purely to keep her father's estate from slipping outside the family line. The orator Esaias built an entire surviving body of work largely around exactly these kinds of inheritance disputes, families fighting bitterly, sometimes for years, over which male relative had the stronger claim to marry a particular heiress and absorb her father's property. Imagine being that young woman for a moment. Your father dies. You did not ask to become overnight the single most contested object in an extended family's financial future. And the law's answer to your sudden inheritance is not autonomy. It's a new marriage, arranged around you, decided by men, justified entirely in terms of keeping money where it belonged. I find myself wanting to push back against flattening this into pure tragedy, though, because that's not quite honest either. Within these rigid structures, individual women clearly found whatever space for agency, affection, even genuine power that the structure allowed. We have evidence, scattered but real, of marriages that by every available account were happy, of wives whose practical management of household wealth was trusted and respected by their husbands precisely because the husband recognized, even within a deeply unequal system, that she was simply better at it than he was. Xenophon's O Economicus, the same treatise we mentioned earlier, presents its idealized husband not as a tyrant but as something closer to a slightly nervous, genuinely respectful partner, explaining household management to his young wife not with contempt but with what reads, even through the distance of language and culture, as a real desire for the household to function as a partnership, however unequal its starting terms. Let's actually walk through a piece of that text in a little more detail because I think it gives us something the dry legal sources can't. Xenophon's narrator, a wealthy Athenian named Isumachus, describes marrying a girl who in his own words was not yet 15, and who had spent her entire short life before the wedding being raised specifically to know as little as possible about running a household, on the theory, common at the time, that a completely untrained, blank young bride was actually preferable, easier to mold into exactly the wife her husband's household required, with no bad habits picked up elsewhere to unlearn. After the wedding, once she had, in his telling, settled in and stopped being quite so shy around him, he sat her down and explained the actual division of their married life. He would manage the outdoor affairs, the farm, the business, the public-facing dealings with other men. She would manage the indoor affairs, the storage and use of grain, wool, household goods, the supervision of slaves, the care of anyone in the household who fell ill, since the indoor world, as he frames it, requires its own kind of competent oversight every bit as demanding as the outdoor world he handles himself. What strikes me most reading this across the gap of 2,500 years isn't the inequality of it, though the inequality is obviously, glaringly there. It's the genuine effort the text makes to dignify the wife's role, to insist, against what must have been a fairly common cultural undercurrent of dismissing women's work as trivial, that what she does inside the walls of the house is just as essential, just as skilled, just as worthy of pride as anything he does outside them. It's a small, real attempt at respect, offered from within a system that structurally could never have offered her actual equality. Both things are true at once. That's just how this history sits. Now, let's talk about the symposium, because this is where the contrast between Melitta's world and the world available to a different kind of woman entirely becomes almost impossible to ignore. In the evenings, particularly when her husband entertained, the andron near the front of the house would fill with male guests reclining on couches, drinking wine mixed with water, since drinking it unmixed was considered a marker of barbarism rather than sophistication, eating, and most importantly, talking for hours about politics, philosophy, poetry, gossip, business. This was in Athenian social life an enormously important institution, the symposium, the place where male friendships were cemented, political alliances quietly formed, reputations built or torn down. Melita would not be there. Not as a guest, not even as a brief presence at the edge of the room. Respectable wives and daughters of citizens did not attend symposia involving guests outside the immediate family. This wasn't a minor social inconvenience. It meant that an entire enormous category of Athenian social, intellectual, and political life simply existed outside her reach, no matter how wealthy, how intelligent, how socially graceful she might have been. But here is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the symposium wasn't entirely without women. It frequently included heterai, a word that gets translated various ways: companion, courtesan, sometimes simply and inadequately as prostitute, though that flattens something more complicated. Heterai were typically not Athenian citizen women. Many were metics, resident foreigners, women who, precisely because they stood outside the rigid legal and social framework that governed citizen wives, were able to move through male social spaces in ways Melita never could. They could attend symposia. They could, by several accounts, hold their own in conversation about poetry and philosophy in a room full of educated men. Some were trained in music, played the aulos or the lyre to entertain guests. Some, the most successful and sought after, became genuinely influential figures, courted by powerful men, discussed in the same gossip networks that discussed Melita's family. The single most famous example, and one worth genuinely understanding rather than just name-dropping, is Aspasia of Miletus, who became the partner, not the legally recognized wife, since Athenian citizenship law at the time technically prevented that, of the statesman Pericles himself, the same man whose funeral oration we paraphrased earlier, the one praising women for being talked about as little as possible. There's an irony there so sharp it's almost funny, if it weren't also genuinely sad. The most prominent woman in 5th century Athens, by far the one history actually remembers by name and personality, rather than as an anonymous wife defined entirely by her husband's reputation, was a woman who existed entirely outside the system that produced that funeral oration's ideal. Aspasia, by later accounts mostly written decades or even centuries after her actual life, including the biographer Plutarch's much later writing, was reputed to have run something like a salon, a gathering place for intellectual conversation, and to have had real personal influence over Pericles himself, advising him by some accounts on rhetoric and policy. I want to be careful here because the ancient sources on Aspasia are genuinely messy and contradictory, and modern historians disagree sometimes sharply on how much of what survives is reliable biography and how much is comic slander, since Athenian playwrights of the period, who loved nothing more than skewering powerful men through their female companions, depicted Aspasia in deliberately scandalous, exaggerated ways, at one point essentially as a brothel keeper, almost certainly as comic exaggeration rather than documented fact. We should hold all of this with appropriate looseness. But even accounting for that uncertainty, the broad shape of her story tells us something real and important: the path to genuine intellectual visibility, to having opinions that powerful men actually listened to being remembered by history with an actual personality rather than a generic epitaph, ran almost entirely through women who stood outside the protective, confining structure that governed respectable wives like Melita. To have Aspasia's freedom, in other words, a citizen's wife would have had to give up the citizenship-adjacent respectability that protected her legally and socially within Athens. And to have Melita's respectability, Aspasia would have had to give up the freedom that made her interesting enough for history to bother remembering her at all. Neither woman, when you actually sit with both of their situations side by side, got to have everything. That's the trade the system offered, and it offered it with grim consistency to every woman within reach of it. Let's bring this back down to the texture of Melita's actual evening, the one happening while that symposium hums on the other side of the courtyard. She and her female household, her own slaves, perhaps her children if they're young enough to still be in the women's quarters, eat separately, earlier, more simply, in rooms apart from the men's gathering. We don't have a huge wealth of detailed sources describing exactly what a wealthy Athenian woman's private dinner looked like on an ordinary evening. Frustratingly, the ancient writers who survived to us were almost universally men writing for other men, and the domestic, female side of household life simply didn't interest them enough to record in much detail. But we can reconstruct the broad outlines from what we know of Athenian diet generally. Bread, wheat for wealthier households, barley more commonly for everyone else, formed the staple. Olive oil, used for cooking, for lamps, for the body after bathing, touched almost every part of daily life. Wine, watered down, accompanied meals across the social spectrum, though the quality and origin of that wine varied enormously with wealth. An expensive imported vintage from one of the Aegean islands, tasting nothing like the rough local stuff that filled a poorer household's cup. Fish was a genuine delicacy in Athens, and a fairly intense object of obsession if the comic playwrights are any guide. Since Aristophanes and his contemporaries repeatedly mock wealthy men for blowing absurd sums of money on fresh fish at market, a kind of conspicuous consumption that apparently struck contemporary Athenians the same way we might roll our eyes at someone bragging about an extravagant restaurant bill today. Cheese, legumes, seasonal vegetables, figs and honey rounded things out. Meat, interestingly, was something most Athenians, even wealthy ones, ate mainly in connection with religious sacrifice, when an animal was ritually killed and its meat then distributed and eaten as part of the festival, rather than as an everyday dietary staple the way it is in much of the modern world. For Melita's household, with money to spend, the meals would have skewed toward more fish, better wine, finer bread, honey cakes for dessert, all of it prepared and served by slaves under her direct supervision, since overseeing food production and preparation was, again, one of the central pillars of what an Athenian wife was actually responsible for managing, even if she rarely touched the cooking fire with her own hands. Now, I promised we'd talk about the festivals, because I think this is genuinely the most important piece of the whole story. The place where the otherwise almost total enclosure of a respectable Athenian woman's life cracked open, briefly, into something approaching genuine public visibility and communal female power. The Thunsmophoria stands out first, and it's worth describing carefully because it's one of the strangest and most fascinating institutions in all of Athenian religious life. Held in the autumn in honor of Demeter, goddess of grain and fertility, this was a festival restricted entirely to married citizen women. Men were excluded completely under threat of severe consequence, an extraordinary inversion in a society otherwise built almost entirely around male public authority. For 3 days, married women left their homes, gathered together at a sanctuary, and conducted rituals that involved fasting, ritual obscenity and joking, the handling and burial of certain offerings, and communal female religious authority that existed nowhere else in Athenian civic life. I want you to actually picture what this meant for someone like Melita. For 3 days, she was not primarily defined as someone's wife, supervised within someone else's walls, moving through a world structured entirely around male permission and male presence. She was part of a citywide community of women, conducting a religious function that the entire city, including every single man in it, depended on and respected, since Demeter's favor was understood to directly affect the harvest that fed everyone. The men of Athens, for these 3 days, simply had to trust that the women knew what they were doing, because the women and only the women were the ones doing it. That's an enormous thing to hold against the rest of what we've described tonight. The same culture that built walls specifically to keep respectable women unseen also built an entire major religious institution that depended completely on those same women stepping outside those walls, gathering in numbers, and exercising a kind of communal authority that no individual woman could access alone. The Panathenaea gives us a different but related window. This was Athens' great civic festival honouring its patron goddess Athena, and one of its central rituals involved presenting the goddess's ancient cult statue with a newly woven robe, a peplos, each year. The weaving of that robe wasn't random labour assigned to whoever happened to be free. Selected young girls from aristocratic families called arepheroi lived for a period at the sanctuary on the Acropolis itself and performed sacred duties connected to this weaving, a genuinely prestigious religious role reserved for daughters of the city's elite families. A small window during which a young aristocratic girl, not yet married, not yet absorbed into some husband's household, held a recognized, respected public religious function in her own right, under her own name, before the rest of her adult life closed back around her. The Brauronia, held at a sanctuary outside the city dedicated to Artemis, involved young girls undergoing a ritual sometimes called the Arcteia, playing the bear, connected to themes of transition from childhood toward marriageable adolescence. And then there was the Adonia, looser, less officially sanctioned, more genuinely personal in character than the grand civic festivals, where women gathered, often on rooftops, to mourn the mythical youth Adonis, planting quick-sprouting, quick-dying seeds in shallow pots, the so-called gardens of Adonis, and engaging in loud, public, and by some accounts genuinely scandalous lamentation that male commentators of the period found either touching or ridiculous depending on their mood, the kind of unrestrained emotional and physical expression that respectable Athenian femininity, in its everyday form, simply never permitted. I think what moves me most about laying all these festivals out together is how clearly they reveal that Athenian culture wasn't simply monolithically opposed to female public life. It was deeply, specifically selective about it. Religious authority, communal mourning, ritual continuity, these were domains where women's collective presence was not just tolerated but required. Political authority, legal independence, economic self-determination, those remained closed, almost without exception. The line wasn't drawn between public and private. It was drawn with real precision around exactly which kinds of public power a woman was permitted to hold. Let's turn now to something we've been circling around without quite landing on directly: motherhood. Because for a woman like Melita, this was, by every measure available to us, both the central purpose her culture assigned to her existence, and one of the most genuinely dangerous experiences she would face in her entire life. Childbirth in the ancient world carried risks that are genuinely difficult to fully convey to a modern audience used to maternal mortality being, statistically, a rare tragedy rather than an ever-present possibility. We don't have precise mortality figures for classical Athens specifically. The record-keeping simply doesn't survive in the detail we'd need. But the broader pattern across the pre-modern ancient and medieval world, repeated across cultures and centuries, was that childbirth represented one of the leading causes of death for women of reproductive age. Full stop. A midwife called a Maya would attend the birth, bringing practical experience built on apprenticeship and repetition rather than anything resembling formal medical training in our sense, along with whatever combination of herbal remedies, ritual practices, and protective amulets the household's tradition called for. If the birth went well and the child survived its first vulnerable days, there were small domestic rituals marking the event, attested in scattered ancient sources. A wreath of olive branches hung on the front door to announce the birth of a boy, a tuft of wool for a girl, a quiet visual signal to the entire street that this household had, or had not, just secured a male heir before a single neighbour needed to ask. That distinction, olive branch for a boy, wool for a girl, tells you almost everything about the relative weight these two outcomes carried. A son meant continuity of the family line, future inheritance of the oikos, eventually a kyrios for his own mother and sisters if his father died. A daughter meant, eventually, another dowry to assemble, another marriage to negotiate, another life that would pass, formally and completely into some other family's control the day she wed. I want to address something here that the historical record genuinely confirms, but that deserves to be handled with real care rather than sensationalized, because it's both true and easily misrepresented. Ancient Greek society, including Athens, is documented as practicing infant exposure in some cases, the abandonment of unwanted newborns, sometimes connected to economic strain, sometimes to the birth of a child with visible disability, sometimes, by some scholarly readings, connected to gender preference, particularly in households already burdened with daughters and the dowries they'd eventually require. We genuinely do not know, and probably never will know with confidence, how common this actually was in practice. The surviving evidence is scattered, indirect, and debated heavily among historians, some arguing it was a relatively rare last resort, others reading the scattered references as evidence of something more routine, particularly in difficult economic periods. What we can say with more confidence is that the practice existed within the realm of legal and social acceptability in a way that would be unthinkable in most cultures today, a sobering reminder that the value placed on any individual infant life, and specifically the value placed on a female infant's life relative to a male one, operated under assumptions genuinely foreign to how most of us think now. For the mothers themselves, women who survived birth and kept their children, raising them within those same secluded household walls was, again, a task largely delegated, at least in its more physically demanding day-to-day form, to others. Wealthy Athenian families, when they could afford it, frequently employed wet nurses, sometimes enslaved women, to handle the actual feeding of infants, a practice attested clearly enough in the surviving sources, including grave markers specifically commemorating beloved nurses, suggesting that whatever the formal economic relationship, real affection sometimes developed between a child and the woman who'd actually nursed and tended it through infancy. Meletta's own relationship with her children, in this picture, would likely have been warmer and more emotionally present than her relationship with the actual physical labor of infant care, supervising rather than performing the daily grinding work of feeding and washing and soothing, much as she supervised rather than personally executed most of the household's textile production. This isn't coldness exactly. It's simply how labor and class operated inside a household built around enslaved domestic work at every level. The wealthier the family, the more buffered the lady of the house was from physically exhausting labor of every kind, childcare very much included. As her children grew, the paths diverged sharply by gender, in ways that by this point in tonight's story probably won't surprise you much. Sons, once they reached a certain age, generally around 7, moved increasingly into a world shaped by their father, and for families that could afford it, by paid tutors and eventually formal education in reading, writing, music, athletics, the kind of broad civic and intellectual formation that prepared a young man for eventual citizenship, public speech, military service, and participation in exactly the kind of political and social life his mother would never be permitted to share. Daughters stayed within the women's quarters, learning, largely from their mothers and the household's older female slaves, the practical skills that would define their own adult lives: spinning, weaving, household management, the careful navigation of female social visits, the religious calendar of festivals open to women. Formal literacy for girls was inconsistent across Athenian society. Some elite families apparently did teach daughters to read and write, enough to manage household accounts or correspondence, but it was nowhere near universal, and certainly nothing resembling the broad intellectual education available to their brothers. A girl's entire formal education, in other words, was preparation for exactly the kind of life Melita herself was already living. A closed loop passed down mother to daughter, generation after generation, largely without the intervention of any institution beyond the household itself. Let's pull back out now and think about the broader shape of wealth and spending in this world, because I think laying the numbers side by side really clarifies just how dramatic the gap was between Melita's household and most of the city around her. We've already touched on the drama a day wage of a skilled laborer, the 100 to 300 drama range for purchasing an enslaved worker, the dowries that could run into the thousands, Let's add a few more figures into that picture. A simple, undecorated household pot or basic furnishing might cost mere obols, fractions of a single drama, well within reach of even a modest household. A length of plain, undyed wool cloth, similarly, sat at a price point most families could manage, if not easily, then at least conceivably, through their own household production rather than market purchase at all. But a single vial of fine imported perfumed oil could run multiple dramas, several days' wages condensed into a small clay or alabaster bottle, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. A finely worked gold necklace, the kind Melita might wear to a festival, easily represented dozens, sometimes hundreds of dramas worth of raw material and skilled goldsmith labor combined. And that purple-bordered himation we described earlier, depending on how much true murex-dyed cloth it actually incorporated, could represent an investment running into the hundreds of dramas all on its own. A single garment worth, in pure economic terms, more than an entire enslaved household worker, sometimes more than several. The household itself, if we tried to total it, slaves, land, the house and its furnishings, jewelry, stored grain and oil, accumulated dowries from past marriages, could represent wealth running into the tens of thousands of drachmas for a genuinely prosperous Athenian family, multiple talents in the era's larger units of account, an amount that set against that single drachma daily wage we keep returning to, separates Melita's household from the labouring families of Athens by a gap that frankly isn't all that different in proportional terms from some of the wealth gaps we still argue about today. What's strange and I think genuinely worth sitting with is how much of that wealth in Melita's specific case existed to be experienced almost entirely within her own walls, by her own household, rather than displayed to the wider world the way wealth often is. We're used to thinking about conspicuous consumption as inherently public. The whole point of a flashy car or a designer handbag is on some level that other people see it. Melita's purple trim, her gold jewelry, her imported perfume, mostly weren't seen by anyone outside a small circle of family, household slaves, and visiting female relatives. The wealth was real, the luxury was real. The audience for it had been almost surgically reduced to the smallest possible circle a respectable culture could manage, while still allowing the wealth to exist at all. I keep returning to this paradox because I think it's the single most counterintuitive thing about Melita's entire existence, and probably the thing that's hardest for a modern listener to really internalize. We assume wealth wants to be seen. Hers, for the most part, simply couldn't be, and that restriction was treated by the very same culture that produced the wealth in the first place as a feature rather than a bug. Proof that the household didn't need to flaunt anything, that its women were so secure, so thoroughly cared for, that they had no need whatsoever to step outside and demonstrate it to anyone. Let's talk, before we move toward the close of tonight's story, about what happened to a woman like Melita as she aged, because this part of the picture tends to get skipped over in popular accounts of ancient Greece, which love lingering on weddings and youth and tend to lose interest the moment a woman stops being young. If Melita's husband died before her, and given the substantial age gap typical of these marriages, this was a genuinely common outcome. Her legal and practical situation depended heavily on circumstances. If she had an adult son, authority over the household, the Kyrios role generally passed to him, even if he was decades younger than his own mother, an arrangement that on paper placed her formally under the legal authority of her own child. In practice, the actual day-to-day management of the household, the supervision of slaves, the organization of domestic production, likely remained substantially in her hands regardless of the formal legal arrangement, since she was, after a lifetime of doing exactly this work, simply more practiced and more knowledgeable about running the place than a young man who'd spent his formative years in the gymnasium and the assembly rather than the storeroom. If she had no surviving son, things grew more complicated, potentially involving a return to her birth family's household under her father's or brother's authority, or, in some circumstances, remarriage, arranged once again by male relatives on her behalf. Much as her first marriage had been, decades earlier, when she herself had been barely more than a child. There's a quiet kind of irony in the trajectory available to an aging widow within this system, actually. The same culture that prized young, untrained, completely malleable brides. The blank slate Xenophon's Ischomachus describes marrying at not yet 15, eventually produced women who, by their 40s or 50s, had accumulated decades of genuinely sophisticated household management experience, financial oversight, supervision of dozens of dependents, navigation of complex family and social networks, real expertise by any honest measure, and yet the formal legal structure around them never really adjusted to recognize their expertise as a form of authority in its own right. She remained legally a dependent, a category to be guarded and managed by whichever male relative happened to be available, regardless of how many decades of competence she'd actually accumulated in the meantime. And yet, within households, informally, the position of an older woman, particularly a mother of adult sons with her own household experience behind her, carried real weight. Greek and Roman sources both, across the centuries, repeatedly reference the genuine influence an older mother could wield within her son's household, sometimes uncomfortably so from the son's perspective, a dynamic that again feels oddly recognizable across an enormous span of time and culture. Formal legal powerlessness somehow coexisted with substantial informal household authority, the two running on entirely separate tracks that rarely intersected cleanly. Let's bring the day back around now, because I want to close where we started, inside that house, as evening properly settles over Athens. The symposium downstairs has likely wound down, or is winding down, guests gradually departing through that same plain street door, back out into a city now lit by scattered torches and oil lamps rather than any kind of continuous illumination, the same deep, true darkness that, in every pre-modern culture we've ever looked at together on this channel, made night feel like a genuinely different world from day, governed by different rules, different fears, different small comforts. Melita, before sleep, would likely undergo some version of an evening washing, water heated and carried by slaves, since indoor plumbing in our modern sense simply didn't exist, poured into a basin or a simple clay tub for washing rather than full immersion bathing in most households. The careful application of the day's cosmetics gently removed, perfumed oil reapplied lightly perhaps, for comfort rather than display now that the day's audience, however limited it had been, had gone home. Her hair would be taken down from whatever arrangement it had held through the day, brushed out, perhaps rebound more simply or left loose for sleep. Her fine clothing, the purple-trimmed himation if she'd worn it, would be carefully folded and stored away by whichever slave held responsibility for the household's textiles, ready to be brought out again the next time occasion demanded it. And then in a simpler garment, in a room kept dim now by a single small oil lamp rather than daylight, she would lie down to sleep in the same upper quarters that had held her, in one sense all day, walls that had kept the wider city out, that had kept her, in the careful, deliberate logic of her entire culture, unseen, unremarked upon, safely and thoroughly enclosed. I think what I want to leave you with tonight isn't a simple verdict on all of this, because I don't think a simple verdict is honest. Melita's life, as we've reconstructed it from the genuine, surviving fragments of evidence historians have spent careers piecing together, contained real comfort, real skill, real moments of community and even joy. The festivals, the visits with other women, the quiet satisfaction of a well-run household, the relationships with her own children. It also contained a structure of confinement and legal erasure that, viewed honestly, is hard to call anything other than what it was. Both of those things were true for her, simultaneously every single day, in the same way that for so many women across so many centuries we've explored together, comfort and constraint turned out to be far less opposed to each other than we tend to assume. Wealth bought her silk-soft wool and gold at her ears and imported perfume from across the sea. It also bought her walls, and a name the world outside her household was never quite meant to learn, and a life lived almost entirely as someone's daughter, then someone's wife, then, if she was fortunate enough to grow old, someone's mother, rarely if ever simply fully herself. History remembers Pericles. It remembers, however messily and through whatever distorted comic lens, Aspasia. It does not remember Melita, because Melita never existed exactly as we've described her tonight. She's a composite, built from the genuine fragments left behind by women just like her, women whose actual names, in the overwhelming majority of cases, simply did not survive, because their own culture, with quiet, deliberate consistency, never thought those names needed to be remembered in the first place. That, I think, is the detail worth carrying with you into sleep tonight. Not the gold, not the purple dye, not even the genuine cruelty of a system that married 14-year-old girls to men 3 times their age and called it the natural order of things. Just this. An entire city's worth of women, generation after generation, ran households, raised children, wove the cloth that clothed an empire, managed wealth they weren't legally permitted to own, and held together behind walls built specifically to keep them unseen, lives every bit as full and complicated and real as anyone we've ever studied from history who actually got to keep their name. And here is something that genuinely surprises people every time I describe it. The single most expensive, most desired, most status-laden textile a wealthy Athenian woman could wear was not silk, which barely existed yet in the Mediterranean world, and would not become widely available for centuries, but extremely fine wool from the island of Miletus, on the coast of what is now Turkey, woven so thin and so tightly that it draped almost like the linen the wealthy also imported from Egypt, a really fine Milesian wool himation, the kind Melissa's husband might have purchased as a wedding gift or brought home after a successful trading venture, could cost the equivalent of what a skilled craftsman earned in several weeks of work. We are talking, in the coinage of the day, something in the range of 1 or 2 drachmas a day for a skilled labourer's wages, and a genuinely fine imported garment running into dozens, sometimes low hundreds, of drachmas depending on quality, dye and embroidery. Speaking of dye, let's talk about colour for a moment, because this is one of those details that quietly reveals everything about who had money and who did not. The vast majority of Athenians, rich and poor alike, wore undyed wool and linen most of the time. Simple off-white, cream, the natural beige of unbleached fibre. Colour was expensive, sometimes staggeringly so. The deep reddish-purple dye extracted, drop by agonizing drop, from the glands of a particular Mediterranean sea snail, the kind that would eventually become famous as Tyrian purple, was so costly that even wealthy households reserved it for trim, for borders, for small accents rather than entire garments, because producing even a small quantity required harvesting and crushing thousands upon thousands of snails. A woman of Melissa's class might own one good dyed garment for festival occasions, perhaps a deep red or a saffron yellow, the saffron dye itself coming from crocus flowers and almost as labour-intensive to produce. And that single garment might represent a genuinely significant fraction of the household's annual spending on clothing. Melissa's slave brings her a bronze hand mirror, polished to a soft, slightly warped reflection, nothing like the crisp clarity we take for granted in our own bathroom mirrors. Glass mirrors with proper silvering were centuries away. What she sees reflected back at her is always a little soft, a little golden, slightly distorted at the edges, and there is something almost merciful in that imprecision, something the Victorian women we talked about, with their precise bronze and later silvered mirrors, did not have the luxury of. Melissa cannot see herself with total clarity, and in a culture that placed enormous, sometimes crushing weight on female modesty and restraint, perhaps that softness of vision was its own small kindness. The cosmetics now. This is where I want you to lean in a little, because what we are about to discuss is genuinely one of the more unsettling true stories buried inside the elegant marble white image most people carry of ancient Greek beauty. The fashionable ideal for a wealthy Athenian woman's skin was pale, almost luminous white, and the reasoning behind this was entirely practical and entirely social at once. Pale skin meant you did not work outdoors, It meant your household was wealthy enough that you never had to walk to the well, never had to labor in a field or a workshop under open sky. Tanned, weathered skin belonged to slaves, to poor working women, to the wives of farmers who had no choice but to be outside. So the wealthy Athenian woman whitened her face deliberately, and the substance she most commonly used to do it was called simithion, white lead, ground into a fine powder and mixed with water or a light oil into a paste that was then smoothed across the face and neck. We know now, with the cold clarity of modern toxicology, that lead absorbed through the skin over years accumulates in the body, damages the nervous system, causes fertility problems, headaches, a slow creeping deterioration that the women applying it every single morning of their adult lives had absolutely no way of detecting or understanding. Ancient physicians occasionally noted that women who used simithion heavily seemed to age strangely, seemed to suffer particular complaints, but the connection to the substance itself was never clearly made, not in this era. It would take well over 2,000 years before anyone definitively proved what was happening beneath that beautiful pale surface. There is something genuinely heartbreaking in that. Something that echoes forward, as we will see later tonight, into other centuries, other women, other poisons applied in pursuit of the same impossible standard. Alongside the white lead, Melissa's slave prepares a small dish of rouge, most likely made from crushed mulberries or the root of the alkanet plant, a deep red pigment dabbed lightly onto the cheeks and sometimes the lips, providing a flush of colour against all that deliberate pallor. For her eyes, a thin application of dark kohl, made from soot or crushed antimony ore, traced carefully along the lash line, a cosmetic tradition that had actually travelled into Greece from Egypt and the Near East over previous centuries, carried along the same trade routes that brought spices and dyes and fine textiles. The overall effect, when finished, was a face that read, to anyone who understood the visual grammar of the period, as unmistakably wealthy, unmistakably protected, unmistakably a woman who never had to leave her own walls if she did not wish to. Now here is something that I think deserves a moment of genuine pause, because it connects directly to a detail we are going to spend a great deal of time with tonight. Melissa's eyebrows, in the fashion of her particular moment in Athenian taste, are meant to meet, or very nearly meet, above the bridge of her nose, sometimes assisted with a touch of dark pigment if nature did not provide a sufficiently dramatic unbroken line. This sounds almost comic to modern ears, accustomed as we are to a completely different beauty standard, but it tells you something important. Beauty standards are never natural. They are never simply what bodies look like. They are always, in every century, a constructed signal, a kind of visible vocabulary that announces status, leisure, conformity and belonging, whether that vocabulary involves a unibrow in classical Athens or a tiny waist in Victorian London. The specific shapes shift. The underlying mechanism, the demand that a woman's body perform her family's status and her own respectability through careful, often uncomfortable or genuinely dangerous modification, that mechanism barely changes at all. Melissa's hair is next, and this takes considerable time, considerable skill, and at least one more slave's full attention. Married Athenian women generally wore their hair pulled back and up, often gathered into a soft knot or bound with ribbons and a fabric band called a sakos, partially or fully covering the hair when she is anywhere a man outside her immediate family might see her. Unmarried girls could wear their hair looser, longer, more visible, one of the small visual cues that announced a young woman's marital status to anyone observing her, which again was meant to be almost nobody, since unmarried girls of good family were kept even more closely than wives. The hairstyling itself involves heated metal tongs, warmed over a small brazier of coals kept specifically for this purpose, used to create gentle waves before the hair is pinned. Hairpins themselves, in a household of Melissa's means, are often bronze or bone, sometimes topped with small decorative finials, occasionally gold for the most special occasions. A truly wealthy household might possess hair ornaments studded with garnets or small pearls brought up from the Red Sea trade routes, pearls being, at this point in history, an extraordinarily rare and costly luxury, far more so than they would later become. And now, finally, the jewellery, which is where I think the genuine scale of wealth in a household like this becomes most vivid. Melissa owns several pairs of gold earrings, some simple drop shapes, one particularly fine pair shaped like tiny winged figures, a popular motif of the period. The gold itself sourced from mines in Thrace or from trade with regions further east. She has a gold necklace strung with small carved beads, perhaps amber traded down from the Baltic along ancient overland routes that connected, even at this early date, the entire breadth of the known world in ways that genuinely astonish people when they first learn about them. She has several finger rings, at least one set with a carved gemstone, a tiny intaglio image of a bee, fittingly enough, that can also be pressed into warm wax to serve as a personal seal, since a woman's signature in the sense we understand it did not exist, but a woman's seal marking cloth she had woven or goods she had authorized to be sent from the household stores absolutely did matter and absolutely was hers. To give you some sense of what all of this represented in real economic terms, a single decent gold ring with a carved stone might cost somewhere in the range of 20 to 50 drachmas, depending on the quality of the carving and the size of the gem, at a time when a single drachma could buy a sheep or feed a family of modest means for several days. A full set of jewellery, the kind Melissa owns and wears on festival days, earrings, necklace, several rings, perhaps a delicate gold wreath of laurel or myrtle leaves worn in the hair for special religious occasions, might represent a value running into the hundreds of drachmas, an amount that, converted loosely and very imperfectly into the labour of an ordinary skilled worker of the time, could represent the better part of a year's wages or more. Jewellery, in other words, was not decoration in any casual sense. It was wealth made wearable, a portable, visible, almost liquid form of family assets that a woman literally carried on her body. This matters more than it might seem, because under Athenian law, Melissa herself could not independently own substantial property. Everything technically belonged to her Kyrios, her legal guardian, which meant her father before marriage and her husband afterward. But jewellery occupied a strange, somewhat protected middle ground. It travelled with her into the marriage as part of her dowry, it was understood, by custom if not always by strict letter of law, to remain meaningfully hers, to be passed eventually to her own daughters, and in the event of a particularly bitter divorce or a husband's financial ruin, the jewellery a wife brought into the household and the value of her dowry were among the very few things the law made some effort to protect for her, or at least for her birth family, since the dowry, if a marriage ended, was generally required to be returned. Let's talk about that dowry for a moment, because it is the financial bedrock underneath everything else we are discussing tonight. When Melissa was 14, her father negotiated her marriage with the family of her husband, a process in which Melissa herself had essentially no voice whatsoever. This was not considered unusual, not considered cruel by the standards of the time, simply how respectable marriages were arranged among citizen families. Her father provided a dowry, a substantial sum, perhaps a talent of silver, which sounds almost mythological to modern ears but was a genuine unit of currency, equivalent to 6,000 drachmas, an amount that could represent the accumulated wealth of a prosperous family across a generation or more. This dowry was not, importantly, a gift to the husband in any simple sense. It remained legally and conceptually tied to Melissa herself, generating in many cases an obligation for her husband to provide her with a certain standard of living proportional to its value, and required again to be returned to her or her family if the marriage dissolved through divorce, which, while rare and socially complicated, was not impossible for a citizen woman to initiate, particularly with her birth family's backing. The dowry, in other words, functioned as a kind of insurance, an imperfect one, dependent entirely on her father's continued willingness and ability to enforce it, but an insurance nonetheless, the only real economic leverage a woman in Melissa's position possessed within a marriage she had never chosen. I want you to sit with that for a moment. the way we sat with similar moments in other centuries, other lives. A 14-year-old girl, married to a man twice her age, her entire future financial security resting on a negotiated sum of silver and the ongoing goodwill of male relatives she could not control. And yet, within this deeply constrained system, women of Melissa's class were not without genuine domestic authority. And this is where the story becomes, I think, considerably more interesting than the simple image of passive female suffering that sometimes gets painted over this entire era. Once dressed, once her hair is arranged and her face prepared, Melissa moves from her private chamber into the section of the house specifically designated for women called the gynikon, or sometimes simply the gynikion. This was a real, physical, architecturally distinct portion of a wealthy Athenian home, typically located either upstairs, away from the street-facing rooms, or toward the rear of the house, around its own small internal courtyard, deliberately separated from the andron, the men's dining and entertaining room, which was usually positioned nearer the street entrance, allowing male guests to come and go for dinners and drinking parties without ever needing to pass through or even glimpse the parts of the house where the women of the family lived their daily lives. This architectural separation was not incidental. It was, by the testimony of writers from the period, considered a matter of real social importance, almost a moral architecture as much as a physical one. The philosopher and military writer Xenophon, in a treatise on household management that survives to us today, describes through the voice of a fictional Athenian gentleman the deliberate design logic behind this separation, the idea that a well-run household required a clear physical boundary between the spaces where a wife's domestic authority operated and the spaces where a husband's public, social, and political life unfolded, with a literal locking door, sometimes mentioned explicitly, separating the two worlds, and the wife typically holding, or being responsible for, the key. And that detail, I think, deserves real attention, because it complicates the simple narrative of a woman as merely a prisoner within her own home. Melissa held the household keys, not metaphorically, literally on a cord or a small ring, the keys to the storerooms, to the chests holding the family's textiles and preserved food, to the locked cabinet where valuables were kept. The management of the entire household economy, the allocation of grain, oil, wine, the preservation of food for winter, the production and storage of cloth, the supervision of every enslaved worker within the walls, all of this fell under her direct, daily, genuinely consequential authority. A wealthy Athenian household might include anywhere from a handful to perhaps a dozen or more enslaved workers, depending on the family's prosperity, and overseeing their labor, their health, their daily tasks, their discipline, was unambiguously the wife's domain, not the husband's. This is, I think, one of the more genuinely complicated truths buried in this whole period of history. The same kind of complicated truth we encountered with those Victorian women and their household ledgers, their invisible labor that nonetheless represented real, substantial, skilled management. Melissa was, within the walls of her own home, something close to a chief executive, responsible for an economic operation that, in a household of real wealth, might rival the scale of a modest business. And yet the moment she stepped beyond those walls, the moment she crossed the threshold into the public life of Athens, all of that authority simply evaporated. She became, in the eyes of the law and the unwritten rules of respectable society alike, almost invisible, almost without standing, a woman who ideally, according to the social ideal articulated again and again by Athenian writers of the period, should be known to her fellow citizens neither for good nor for ill, should generate, in the words attributed by the historian Thucydides to the statesman Pericles in a famous funeral oration, as little discussion among men as possible. Let that sit with you for a moment, because I think it is genuinely one of the strangest and most revealing ideals of this entire civilization. The greatest compliment available to a respectable woman of Melissa's class was in essence to not be talked about at all, not praised, not admired publicly, not the subject of gossip, good or bad, simply absent from the conversation entirely, her existence sufficiently well managed and sufficiently obscured that men outside her family had nothing to say about her one way or another. Compare that, for a moment, to literally any other form of public recognition we associate with achievement, with status, with a life well lived, and you start to understand just how fundamentally different the architecture of female honor was in this particular world. So what did Melissa actually do, hour by hour, inside those walls, in this life so deliberately constructed to keep her unseen and unremarked upon? Let's follow her morning a little further, because the answer is considerably more textured and more physically demanding than the word seclusion alone might suggest. After breakfast, which in a household like this was a relatively modest affair, perhaps barley bread, a little cheese, some diluted wine, eaten separately from her husband if he had already left for the day's business in the city, Melissa moves to the courtyard, the small open-air space at the centre of the house around which the women's quarters were typically arranged, providing light and air to rooms that otherwise had few or no windows facing outward. Here, in the gentle morning light, the real work of the day begins, and it is work centered almost entirely around wool. I want to spend real time on this because I think the modern mind, encountering the phrase spinning and weaving, tends to picture something gentle, decorative, almost a hobby, the way we might picture a wealthy Victorian woman with embroidery. That picture is wrong, or at least dramatically incomplete. Wool production in a household like Melissa's was an enormous, continuous, economically essential operation, one that consumed a substantial portion of every single day, supervised personally by the wife of the house, who was expected, by the deepest cultural values of her society, to be personally skilled at every stage of the process herself, not merely to oversee slaves doing it. The raw wool arrives from the family's own flocks, if they owned land with grazing rights, or purchased from dealers in the market, in great dirty oily masses that must first be washed. An unglamorous, smelly process involving repeated soaking and rinsing to remove the lanolin grease and embedded dirt, conducted usually by the household's enslaved workers in large basins, the wastewater carrying off a smell that anyone who has ever processed raw wool by hand will recognize instantly, somewhere between sheep and something faintly sour. Once washed and dried, the wool must be carded, combed out with paddles or simple toothed combs to align the fibers and remove any remaining debris before it is ready for spinning. And spinning in this world, before the spinning wheel had been invented, before any mechanical assistance whatsoever existed, was done entirely by hand using a spindle and a distaff, a wooden rod that held the prepared fiber while the spinner drew it out with one hand and set the spindle twirling with the other, twisting the loose fiber into a continuous, even thread through nothing but practiced skill and constant repetitive motion. This was considered, and I find this genuinely fascinating, the single most essential and most ideologically loaded domestic skill a respectable Athenian woman could possess. The mythical queen Penelope, wife of the wandering hero Odysseus, was celebrated across Greek literature precisely for her skill and fidelity at the loom, famously weaving and unweaving a burial shroud for years to delay suitors while she waited, faithfully, for her husband's return. That story was not simply entertainment, it was a moral template held up explicitly as the model every respectable wife was meant to emulate, her virtue and her domestic industry treated as two sides of literally the same coin, woven quite literally into the same cloth. A woman like Melissa would spend hours of every single day, not occasionally, not as a leisurely pastime, but as a serious, expected, near-constant activity, either spinning thread herself, or supervising and working alongside the household's enslaved women as they did the same. Once sufficient thread had been spun, it moved to the loom, a tall freestanding wooden frame against which the warp threads hung weighted at the bottom, the weaver standing rather than sitting, working the weft thread back and forth with a shuttle, beating each row firm with a wooden batten, building up, inch by painstaking inch, the cloth that would eventually become a chiton, a hymation, a blanket, a wall hanging, depending on the household's needs. The economics here matter enormously, and I think this is something that genuinely gets lost when we picture ancient Greek domestic life. Cloth in this world was not something you simply purchased ready-made in the way we think of buying clothing today. While there absolutely were professional weavers and textile merchants in Athens, particularly for the most luxurious imported fabrics like that fine Milesian wool we discussed earlier, the everyday garments worn by a household, the bed linens, the working cloth used by slaves, the religious dedications regularly made to temples, all of this represented enormous value if purchased outright, and a wealthy household producing its own cloth at home, through the labor of its women, both free and enslaved, was engaging in something close to genuine domestic manufacturing, generating real, substantial economic value that directly offset what would otherwise have been significant household expenditure. So when we say that Melissa spent much of her day at the loom, we are not describing a decorative pastime. We are describing skilled, valuable, economically essential labor, the kind that in a different century, in that Victorian world we visited before, got dismissed in the official census records as not gainfully employed, even as it sustained an entire household's material existence. The parallel, I think, is genuinely worth sitting with. Now, around midday, let's imagine something happens that breaks the rhythm of Melissa's day. Because households did, even within their careful seclusion, occasionally receive visitors, and the rules governing exactly who could see whom and under what circumstances reveal an enormous amount about how this entire system actually functioned in daily practice. A female relative, let's say Melissa's mother, or perhaps a married sister living elsewhere in the city, arrives at the house, accompanied, as any respectable woman traveling even a short distance through the streets absolutely had to be, by at least one slave attendant, and ideally by an older woman as well if the distance involved was significant. This is one of the genuine hard limits on elite female mobility in Athens that surprises people most. A woman of good family essentially did not walk through the streets of her own city alone, not ever, not under any normal circumstance. The streets themselves were considered by the deepest unwritten rules of respectability fundamentally a male space, populated by male citizens going about business, by slaves running errands, by the kind of women, poorer women, market vendors, prostitutes, who simply could not afford the luxury of seclusion, and whose presence in public was, in the brutal social calculus of the time, taken as evidence of their lower status rather than scandal in itself. When Melissa's visiting relative is escorted into the house, she is brought directly into the women's quarters, never into the andra near the entrance where male guests would be received, and the two women spend the afternoon together in conversation, in shared needlework, perhaps with refreshments brought by a slave, watered wine, some dried figs, a little honey cake. This visiting, this network of female relatives and close family friends moving between households under careful supervision, represented essentially the entire social world available to a woman like Melissa. It was not nothing. Genuine friendships, genuine emotional support, genuine exchange of practical knowledge about managing households, about childbirth, about navigating difficult husbands or mothers-in-law, almost certainly flowed through exactly these channels, much as we saw happen with the colonial American women and their evening spinning circles, their work frolics, gathering in defiance of isolation even within a system designed to keep them separate. But here is the limitation, and it is a real one. This entire social world existed almost entirely within private homes, moving carefully from one set of walls to another, almost never touching the genuinely public life of the city at all. Compare this to her husband, who that very same afternoon might be conducting business in the Agora, attending a meeting of the assembly if it happened to be in session, discussing politics and philosophy with friends in a public colonnade, watching a court case unfold, or simply standing in the open air exchanging news and opinions with dozens of other citizens, the kind of casual, constant, public social and political life that constituted, for Athenian men, the very texture of citizenship itself. The Agora deserves a moment of its own here because it occupied a place in Athenian life that genuinely had no female equivalent. This was the central marketplace and civic heart of the city, an open square ringed with public buildings, lined with stalls selling everything from fish and olive oil to fine pottery and imported luxuries, the physical location where merchants conducted business, where political speeches happened informally among gathered citizens, where news travelled, where reputations were made and unmade through constant face-to-face public interaction. For an Athenian man, regular presence in the Agora was simply part of being a citizen, part of being a recognizable, socially embedded adult member of the community. For a woman of Melissa's status, the Agora was, for all practical purposes, off-limits, not by any single explicit law that I'm aware of, but by an overwhelming weight of social custom so deeply embedded that violating it would have constituted a genuine scandal, a visible mark against both her own reputation and that of her entire household. The actual buying and selling required by the household, purchasing food, fuel, household goods, was conducted instead by male family members or, very commonly, by trusted male slaves sent out with specific instructions and a set sum of money, returning with the goods Melissa had specified she needed. This meant something genuinely strange when you sit with it for a moment. Melissa, who managed her household's entire internal economy with real skill and real authority, who knew exactly how much grain remained in storage, how much oil, how much wine, what quantities would be needed before the next harvest, nonetheless had no direct personal contact whatsoever with the actual marketplace where these goods were purchased. She set the demand. She never touched the supply chain. Her authority operated entirely within a closed loop, bounded by her own walls, dependent at every external point on male intermediaries, whether that intermediary was her husband, her grown son if she had one, or an enslaved man trusted enough to be sent into the city on her behalf. There were, I should say, some genuine exceptions to this pattern of seclusion, and they matter because without them the picture becomes too flat, too uniformly grim, and the real historical truth, as always, carries more texture than that. Poorer Athenian women, those whose households simply could not afford to keep a wife entirely removed from productive outside labour, regularly worked as market vendors themselves, sold bread or vegetables or simple goods in stalls, worked as wet nurses, as midwives, as washerwomen at the public fountain houses where water was drawn for households that lacked private wells. Citizenship law and elite ideology constructed an ideal of total female seclusion, but economic reality meant that ideal was, by simple necessity, only ever fully achieved by the genuinely wealthy. And this is where I want to pause and ask you to hold two things in your mind simultaneously, because I think it is genuinely important and it echoes something we touched on in an entirely different century, with an entirely different set of women. The poorer woman selling vegetables in the Agora had freedoms Melissa did not. She walked the streets, she spoke directly with strangers, conducted her own transactions, moved through public space with an ease that would have been unthinkable for a woman of Melissa's class. And yet she also bore the full physical burden of outdoor labour, sun exposure that darkened her skin in a culture that read pale skin as a status marker, the genuine economic precarity of a household with no substantial buffer against bad harvests or bad luck. None of the material comfort, the imported wool, the gold jewellery, the household full of slaves performing the heaviest labour that defined Melissa's daily existence. Neither woman's life was simply better than the other's. Both were shaped by the same underlying system, the same fundamental assumption that women's lives existed to serve and reflect the honour and prosperity of male-headed households, but that system distributed its particular burdens and its particular comforts in dramatically uneven ways depending on wealth. And I think it is worth sitting with the discomfort of that complexity rather than collapsing it into a single, simpler story. Let's return to Melissa's afternoon, because there is one more category of female experience in Athens that deserves real attention, precisely because it represents the deliberate, almost calculated opposite of everything we have described so far, and understanding it actually helps illuminate, by sharp contrast, exactly what was being protected and constrained in a woman like Melissa's life. That evening, Melissa's husband, whose name let's say was Philon, will be hosting a symposium, a formal drinking and dining gathering for a group of his male friends and associates, the kind of social event that constituted an enormous part of elite male Athenian social and intellectual life. The andron, that male dining room positioned near the front of the house, is being prepared throughout the day, couches arranged around the walls in the traditional manner, fine pottery brought out, wine mixed with water in large mixing vessels called craters, since the Greeks considered drinking wine completely undiluted to be a sign of barbarism, something the uncivilized peoples beyond their borders did. Melissa herself will not attend this gathering. This bears repeating because I think it genuinely surprises people who have absorbed a vaguer, more romanticized image of Greek social life. A respectable wife did not attend her own husband's dinner parties, did not recline on a couch with his guests, did not participate in the wine, the conversation, the music, the intellectual debate that characterized a proper Athenian symposium at its best. She remained for the entire duration of the evening in the women's quarters, possibly able to hear distant sounds of music and laughter drifting through the house, but entirely excluded from the gathering itself. So who then did attend, beyond the male guests themselves? This is where we encounter the hetera, and I think understanding her role tells us something genuinely important about the whole architecture of respectability that governed women like Melissa's life. The hetera, a word that translates roughly and imperfectly as companion, occupied a category of female existence that simply had no equivalent for a respectable wife. These were women, often highly skilled in music, in witty and educated conversation, in poetry, sometimes genuinely literate and intellectually engaged in the philosophical debates of the day, in ways that elite wives deliberately denied that kind of education, generally were not. Some hetera achieved real, lasting fame, their names recorded by historians and philosophers, their company sought after by some of the most prominent men in Athenian society. But that fame, that intellectual engagement, that genuine social visibility, came at the direct cost of the one thing protected so fiercely for women like Melissa, namely her formal honor, her status as a citizen's wife, her legal protection, and her children's claim to citizenship. A hetera existed largely outside the formal structures of citizen family life. Often, though not always, was herself not a citizen at all, sometimes a freed slave or the daughter of a foreigner. And while she might enjoy genuine wealth, genuine influence, genuine intellectual freedom unavailable to any respectable wife, she possessed none of the legal protections, none of the formal social standing, none of the assured material security that Melissa's dowry and marriage contract, imperfect as they were, at least theoretically guaranteed her. I find this contrast genuinely one of the most revealing things about the entire system, and I want to sit with it honestly rather than simplify it. Athenian elite society effectively split female existence into two almost completely separate tracks. One track offered security, legal protection, the dignity of legitimate motherhood and household authority, purchased at the total cost of public visibility, intellectual engagement, and personal autonomy. The other offered exactly the freedoms the first track denied: public presence, intellectual conversation, genuine personal choice in at least some matters, purchased at the total cost of legal security and what the culture defined as honor. No woman, as far as the system was designed, was meant to have both. This evening, as Philan's guests arrive, as the wine begins to flow and the conversation in the andron grows louder, more animated, ranging across politics, philosophy, gossip, poetry, perhaps even, on a particularly memorable evening, genuinely serious intellectual debate of the kind that has survived for us in works like Plato's dialogues, several of which are explicitly structured as the record of conversations that supposedly happened at exactly this kind of gathering. Melissa sits in the women's quarters with her own household, perhaps continuing her wool work by lamplight, perhaps simply sitting with her slaves in quiet conversation, listening to the distant, muffled sounds of a social and intellectual world happening just beyond a wall she will never cross. I don't want to romanticize her isolation here, but I also don't want to flatten it into pure misery, because the historical reality, as best we can reconstruct it, was almost certainly more complicated than either extreme. We have, frustratingly, very few surviving sources written by Athenian women themselves about their own inner experience of this life, since the formal literacy and literary education that might have produced such records was itself something elite women were generally denied. Almost everything we know about how women like Melissa might have felt comes to us filtered through male writers, philosophers, playwrights, historians, who had their own particular interests, their own particular blind spots in describing female experience. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: within the women's quarters, a genuine, rich, female-centered social and emotional world did exist, even if it operated entirely separately from, and largely invisible to, the public male-dominated life of the city. Mothers, daughters, sisters, female slaves who in some households developed real bonds of affection and loyalty with the women they served, despite the brutal underlying inequality of their relationship. Female friends and relatives moving between households. All of this constituted a genuine social fabric, simply one that left far fewer traces in the historical record than the public, literate, male-dominated world of politics and philosophy that we know so much more about. Let's move forward into the evening proper, because there is something else happening tonight in Melissa's household that deserves real attention, something that connects directly to one of the very few socially sanctioned spaces where Athenian women, including women of the highest respectability, were not only permitted but actually expected and required to appear in genuinely public settings. I'm talking about religious festivals, and I think this is one of the most genuinely fascinating and underappreciated aspects of female experience in this entire era. Athenian civic religion required, by deep and ancient custom, the active participation of women in numerous major festivals throughout the ritual calendar, and several of the most important religious occasions of the entire year were either exclusively female in their participation, or required female involvement that simply could not be performed by men at all. This created a strange paradox sitting right at the center of Athenian gender ideology. The same culture that constructed elaborate systems to keep respectable women invisible in ordinary daily life simultaneously required those exact same women to step into highly visible, sometimes genuinely public-facing religious roles, because the gods quite simply demanded it, and no amount of social anxiety about female visibility could override that requirement. The most significant of these was probably the Thesmophoria, a festival celebrated exclusively by married citizen women, from which men were entirely and absolutely excluded, dedicated to the goddesses Demeter and her daughter Persephone, connected deeply to agricultural fertility and the mysteries surrounding the changing seasons. For 3 days each autumn, married women across Athens would leave their homes, gather together, and conduct rites that were, quite deliberately, kept secret from the male population entirely. We know remarkably little about the actual content of these rituals, precisely because the secrecy was taken so seriously that almost no detailed first-hand account survives, but we know they involved fasting, certain ritual obscenities and jokes considered appropriate specifically within this all-female sacred context, and rites connected to fertility, to the buried seeds of the next year's harvest, to the cyclical mystery of death and renewal embodied in the myth of Persephone's descent into and return from the underworld. Think about what this actually meant for a woman like Melissa. For 3 days each year, she would leave her own house, gather with other married women from across the city, participate in rituals from which her husband and every other man in Athens was strictly forbidden, occupying, for this brief sacred window, a position of genuine collective female authority and public religious significance that had absolutely no equivalent anywhere else in her social existence. The household for those days would have to function with her temporarily absent, the normal flow of male authority and oversight suspended in deference to a religious obligation considered so fundamental to the city's well-being that it simply could not be set aside. There is something genuinely striking, I think, in the fact that the one moment of the year when Athenian women collectively claimed real, sanctioned public authority was precisely the moment connected to the literal fertility of the earth. to the production of grain that sustained the entire city, an authority rooted directly in the same underlying cultural logic that had elite women spending their days at the loom, producing essential goods through patient, cyclical, often invisible female labor. The thesmophoria, in other words, was not a contradiction of the broader system. It was, in a strange way, its sacred mirror image, the one place where the deep cultural association between women and fertility, women and the patient cyclical sustaining of life, was allowed to flower into genuine collective public power precisely because it served the city's interests rather than threatening them. Other festivals offered different, though related forms of visibility. The Panathenaea, the great civic festival held in honor of Athena, the city's patron goddess, required the participation of carefully selected unmarried girls from the city's most respectable families, chosen for the honor of serving as kanaphoroi, basket bearers, who would carry sacred implements in the grand procession that wound through the city to the Acropolis itself, dressed in fine clothing specifically for the occasion, visible to literally the entire assembled population of Athens in a way that would have been absolutely unthinkable in any other context. This was, by all accounts, considered an enormous honor, the kind of public recognition a family might compete for and remember with pride for generations, and it reveals something important about how the system actually worked in practice. Visibility itself was not inherently dishonorable for an Athenian woman. What mattered was the context, the sanctioned purpose, the religious or civic framework that transformed potentially scandalous female public presence into something the entire community could celebrate without anxiety. A girl walking the streets alone to visit a friend was a minor scandal. The same girl walking through those same streets as part of a sacred procession honoring Athena, dressed in fine garments specifically chosen to be seen, was the highest honor her family could receive. And then there is the Arctea, performed at the sanctuary of Artemis at Broron, a coastal site not far from the city, where young girls, somewhere between roughly 5 and 10 years old, would spend a period of time, possibly several years intermittently, living at the sanctuary, participating in rituals connected to the goddess Artemis in her aspect as protector of young girls and of women in childbirth. The girls were sometimes referred to in surviving accounts as little bears, and the rituals involved appear to have included some form of ritual running or dancing, possibly connected symbolically to the wildness and danger of untamed female youth being gradually civilized and prepared, through sacred ritual, for the eventual transition into respectable married womanhood. Melissa herself, decades earlier, as a small girl, may very well have spent time at exactly this sanctuary, one of the very few periods in her entire life when she would have lived, even briefly, in a community made up almost entirely of other girls and women, away from her immediate family's household, under religious rather than purely domestic authority. I find myself thinking about that detail often, the idea of small girls sent away, even briefly, to a coastal sanctuary, dancing or running in rituals whose precise meaning is now lost to us, in service of a goddess who protected exactly the kind of dangerous liminal transition from wild childhood into the controlled domesticity of marriage that defined so much of what would come to define their adult lives. There is something genuinely poignant in imagining young Melissa there, free in a way her adult life would never quite allow again, even if that freedom was itself simply preparation for its eventual loss. Now let's bring our attention back fully to the household, to the evening unfolding around Melissa, because there is more to her day than wool and religion and the distant sound of her husband's symposium drifting through the walls. Let's talk about bathing, about scent, about the genuine sensory texture of luxury in this world, because I think it deserves the same careful, loving attention we gave to Victorian cold cream and colonial candle wax. Bathing in a wealthy Athenian household did not involve anything resembling our modern bathroom. There was no plumbing in the sense we understand it, no running water delivered to individual rooms. Instead, water was heated over the household hearth, or a dedicated small furnace, carried by slaves in large jars or basins to a designated bathing area, often simply a room with good drainage built into the floor, and poured over the bather standing in a large terracotta or bronze basin, or sometimes simply sponged over the body by an attendant while the bather stood or sat. This process, simple as it sounds described in those plain terms, was actually accompanied by an entire culture of scented oils that genuinely rivals anything we discussed in the Victorian skincare cabinet. Olive oil formed the base of nearly every perfumed preparation, infused for weeks or months with flowers, herbs, and imported aromatic resins, the oil absorbing and carrying their scent, then applied generously to the skin both for genuine cleansing purposes, since soap as we understand it was not yet in common use, and as a luxury cosmetic in its own right, leaving the skin scented, softened, and in a sun-drenched Mediterranean climate, genuinely protected to some degree from drying and cracking. The most prized scented oils in Melissa's household would likely have included rose oil, the petals imported or grown in dedicated household gardens and infused into the base olive oil through careful repeated processing, and myrrh, a fragrant resin harvested from trees native to the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa, transported across enormous distances along trade routes that connected Athens to a genuinely vast commercial network, one that historians sometimes underestimate when picturing the supposedly isolated ancient world. A small alabaster jar of genuinely fine myrrh-based perfume, the kind reserved for special occasions, religious festivals, perhaps the rare evening when Melissa might actually have reason to dress at her absolute finest, could represent a substantial expense, the imported resin itself having travelled thousands of miles by camel caravan and then by ship before it ever reached an Athenian merchant's stall. This is, I think, one of the details that most powerfully connects ancient Athens to the world we actually live in today, more directly than almost any other single fact I could share with you. The perfume warming on Melissa's skin tonight, as she sits in her own quiet rooms while her husband entertains in the Andron, very likely travelled along trade networks that stretched from Arabia through intermediary ports in the eastern Mediterranean, carried by merchants and sailors whose names we will never know, representing months of travel and multiple separate transactions before it ever reached her household. The ancient world, for all its physical limitations, for all the genuine slowness and danger of travel by ship and overland caravan, was nonetheless a profoundly surprisingly connected place, its luxury goods circulating across distances that would genuinely astonish people who imagine antiquity as a collection of isolated, self-contained little city-states. Let's talk about furniture for a moment too, because the Andron where Philon's guests are currently reclining, and the women's quarters where Melissa sits, would have contained genuinely different qualities and quantities of furnishing, reflecting both the gendered division of household space and the simple fact that the Andron, as the room meant to display the family's status to outside male visitors, received the lion's share of conspicuous household investment. The couches in the Andron, called Tonigh, on which guests would recline during the symposium rather than sit upright in the way we might assume, were typically wooden frames, the finest examples inlaid with ivory, sometimes silver, the legs carved into elegant, turned or animal-shaped forms, topped with cushions and woven coverings, sometimes the very wool textiles Melissa's own household had produced. A genuinely fine set of dining couches, the kind appropriate for entertaining guests whose opinion mattered to Philon's social and political standing, could represent a substantial investment, hundreds of drachmas across the full set required to properly furnish even a modestly sized Andron. The drinking vessels themselves deserve mention too, because Athenian pottery from this exact period represents some of the most sophisticated and genuinely beautiful decorative art the ancient world produced. The famous red figure and black figure techniques creating vivid scenes of mythology, daily life, and symposium revelry directly onto the surface of cups, mixing bowls and wine jugs that we still find remarkably preserved in archaeological excavations and museum collections today. A fine painted crater, the large vessel used to mix wine with water at the heart of any symposium, decorated by one of the period's recognized master painters, could represent a genuinely significant purchase. the kind of object a wealthy household might display with real pride, the visual equivalent of fine silver in a much later century's dining room. Meanwhile, in the women's quarters, the furnishing tends, by every archaeological and textual indication we possess, towards simpler, more purely functional pieces. Wooden chests for storing cloth and valuables, simple stools and chairs, the loom itself occupying significant space, perhaps a small altar or shrine for household religious observances, since the wife of the house typically bore primary responsibility for maintaining the household's daily religious devotions. The small offerings made to Hestia, goddess of the hearth, and other protective household deities. The contrast in furnishing between these two spaces tells its own quiet story. One space designed and equipped to display wealth and status to an external male audience, the other equipped purely for the internal functional needs of daily domestic production and private female life. Let's return now to the question of children, because this is where the deeper purpose underlying so much of what we've discussed tonight comes most sharply into focus, and where the genuine emotional stakes of Melissa's existence become, I think, most vivid and most moving. Melissa has, let's say, 3 living children, a son who is now 12 and being educated by a private tutor, since formal schools in our modern sense did not yet exist in quite the way we'd recognize, and 2 daughters, one 9 and one just turned 4. She has also, and this is a detail that genuinely needs to be sat with rather than glossed over, lost 2 other children in infancy, a fact that would not have been considered unusual or particularly remarkable in her social circle, given the genuinely staggering rates of infant and child mortality across the entire ancient world, rates that simply dwarf anything familiar to us from later, better documented centuries, let alone our own. Childbirth itself, in Melissa's world, happened almost entirely within the women's quarters of the home, attended by a midwife, a woman with specialized practical experience and knowledge passed down through oral tradition and apprenticeship, rather than any formal medical training in our sense, supported by female relatives and household slaves, with absolutely no male physician present except in the rarest and most desperate circumstances. The dangers were genuinely severe, both for the mother and the infant, and the religious dimension of childbirth reflects this danger directly. Artemis, in her aspect as protector of childbirth, received particular prayers and offerings during a woman's labor, and women who survived childbirth safely, particularly after a difficult or dangerous delivery, might make dedications at her sanctuaries in genuine gratitude for having come through an ordeal that, statistically, claimed a meaningful percentage of the women who underwent it. When a child was born, the decision of whether to formally accept and raise that child rested, under Athenian custom and law, with the father, not the mother. A fact that I think genuinely needs acknowledging honestly rather than softened, because it represents one of the starker asymmetries of power within this entire system. A formal ceremony called the amphidromia, held several days after birth, involved the father carrying the infant in a ritual circuit around the household hearth, a public act of acceptance that formally welcomed the child into the family. Before this ceremony, and in rare and difficult circumstances even after it in some recorded cases, a father held the legal and customary authority to decide that a child, particularly a child born with visible disability, or in a household genuinely unable to support additional children, would not be raised, a practice historians refer to as exposure, in which the infant was left in a public place, sometimes with the faint desperate hope, reflected in some surviving literature, that a passerby might take the child in, but very often resulting in the infant's death. I want to be careful and honest here. The way the better historical accounts I've studied tend to be honest about difficult material, rather than either sensationalizing this practice or minimizing it. Historians genuinely debate how common infant exposure actually was in practice across different periods and different social classes in Athens, and the evidence is frustratingly incomplete, drawn largely from literary and legal references rather than direct demographic records. What we can say with confidence is that the legal and cultural framework gave fathers, not mothers, this devastating authority, and that a mother like Melissa, having carried and delivered a child through genuine physical danger, had no formal legal power whatsoever to prevent her husband's decision in this matter, whatever grief or resistance she might have felt privately within her own heart. This is, I think, one of the genuinely darkest threads running through this entire picture of elite Athenian domestic life. And I don't want to rush past it simply because the rest of the story involves perfume and gold jewelry and the genuine warmth of female friendship within the women's quarters. The same system that gave Melissa real domestic authority, real economic management of her household, real social bonds with other women, also rested on a foundation in which her most fundamental experience as a mother, the survival of the children she bore, remained ultimately subject to decisions made entirely outside her own legal control. Let's soften the tone slightly and turn to something gentler, because Melissa's surviving children, particularly her daughters, occupy her attention and her teaching in ways that connect directly back to everything we have discussed about the cycle of female domestic preparation. Her 9-year-old daughter is already beginning to learn the basics of spinning, sitting beside her mother with a small practice spindle, the same patient, repetitive skill that will, within just 5 or 6 more years, become the central occupation of her own adult life as a wife in some other household, the specific household not yet determined, dependent entirely on whatever marriage alliance Philon eventually negotiates on her behalf with another citizen family. This points us towards something genuinely important about female education in this world, namely how narrow and specifically domestic it actually was for girls of even the wealthiest families, in sharp and deliberate contrast to the education available to their brothers. Melissa's son, at 12, is learning to read and write, studying poetry, particularly the great epic works of Homer, learning music, likely the lyre, receiving physical training that will eventually include more serious athletic and military preparation as he approaches the age when Athenian citizens were expected to undergo formal military training. Her daughters receive essentially none of this. Their education consists almost entirely of domestic skills: spinning, weaving, household management, basic religious knowledge necessary for participating properly in festivals, and perhaps, in genuinely progressive or unusually wealthy households, some limited informal literacy, enough to read simple texts or manage household accounts, though even this was far from universal and depended enormously on individual family inclination rather than any broader social expectation. This educational gap, I think, deserves to be understood as something more than simply an unfortunate oversight or a reflection of limited resources. It represents a genuinely coherent, deliberate logic, however troubling it appears to modern sensibilities. If a respectable woman's entire purpose, according to the dominant ideology of the time, was to manage a household, bear legitimate children, and remain as invisible and unremarked upon in public discourse as possible, then literary education, philosophical training, the kind of intellectual cultivation reserved for heterae precisely because those women operated entirely outside the respectable citizen family structure, served no purpose within that narrow definition of female virtue, and in fact, by the logic of the time, might actively undermine it, cultivating exactly the kind of independent thought and public engagement the entire system was designed to suppress. We should pause here, though, because there is real historical complexity worth acknowledging, the same kind of complexity that kept surfacing in our earlier explorations of other centuries. Sparta, Athens' great rival city-state, took a genuinely different approach to female education and physical development, training girls in athletics, sometimes even allowing them limited participation in certain forms of public competition, an approach that Athenian writers, including the historian Xenophon, whom we mentioned earlier, sometimes commented on with a mixture of fascination and faint scandal, evidence that even within the ancient Greek world, the particular constraints shaping Melissa's life in Athens were not universal, were not simply an inevitable feature of ancient Greek society as a monolithic whole, but a specific cultural choice made by one particular city among many. each of which constructed female life according to its own particular values and priorities. Let's move now toward the later part of the evening, because Melissa's day, despite everything we've discussed about seclusion and constraint, is not yet finished, and there is one more dimension of elite female experience that deserves real attention before we let her and ourselves finally rest. Death and mourning in Athenian society fell almost entirely within the female domain, representing, alongside the religious festivals we discussed earlier, one of the genuine areas of sanctioned, even essential, public female visibility and authority. When a member of the household died, it was the women, the wife, the mother, female relatives, and household slaves who performed the ritual washing and preparation of the body, who arranged the formal lamentation that traditionally accompanied an Athenian funeral procession, their grief expressed through ritualized wailing and lament that, far from being suppressed or considered inappropriate public emotion, was actually expected, almost required, as the proper expression of a household's loss. This created, interestingly, enough genuine social anxiety among Athenian male lawmakers that several recorded laws, attributed in some surviving accounts to the early lawgiver Solon, attempted to actually limit and regulate the scale and intensity of female funeral lamentation, restricting the number of women who could participate in mourning processions outside the immediate family, limiting the volume and duration of public grief displays. Evidence that this particular sanctioned female public role had, at some point, grown extensive and visible enough to genuinely concern the male civic authorities responsible for maintaining what they considered appropriate public order and decorum. I find this detail genuinely fascinating, because it reveals something true about the whole system we've been exploring tonight. Female public visibility was not in itself the fundamental problem from the perspective of Athenian male authority. The problem was always specifically uncontrolled, unsanctioned female visibility, visibility that operated outside the careful frameworks of religious obligation, ritual mourning, or formally honored civic procession. The moment female public expression grew large enough, loud enough, sustained enough to feel genuinely uncontrolled, even within a sanctioned ritual context like funeral lamentation, the same anxious impulse toward regulation and constraint that governed every other aspect of women's lives reasserted itself immediately. Melissa herself, in the years before tonight's quiet evening, has performed this exact role for her own mother, several years deceased now, and for one of the 2 infant children she lost, small, devastating losses that she mourned according to these same ancient, deeply embedded rituals: the formal washing and anointing of the small body, the procession to burial, the lamentation that gave her grief a sanctioned, structured, communally witnessed form of expression that, whatever its limitations, at least offered something the rest of her constrained social existence rarely did: a genuine, visible, socially honored outlet for her deepest private emotion. Now, as the evening genuinely deepens, as the sounds from the andron gradually grow quieter, the symposium winding down, perhaps some of Philon's guests already departing into the dark streets accompanied by torch-bearing slaves, Melissa prepares for sleep. There is no elaborate Victorian-style ritual of corsets and 100 hairbrush strokes here, not in quite the same way, but there is nonetheless a quiet, deliberate winding down of the day, the removal of jewelry, placed carefully back into its small wooden or bronze box, the unpinning of the chiton, the washing of the white lead and rouge from her face, leaving, underneath all that careful daytime construction, simply a tired woman in her mid-20s, her actual skin finally visible to no one but herself, and perhaps the single slave still attending her in these final hours before rest. I think about that moment often when I sit with this history, the parallel it draws across centuries to other women we've spent time with in other stories, other nights. The Victorian housewife removing her girdle with a gasp of relief, the moment of private, unwitnessed authenticity that exists underneath every layer of public performance every single culture seems to demand of its women in one form or another. Melissa, washing the lead-white paste from her face in the dim lamplight, her real skin emerging tired and human beneath it, is doing something genuinely timeless, something that connects her directly across more than 2,000 years to every other woman who has ever spent a day performing a constructed version of herself for a world that demanded it, only to find, in the private hours before sleep, something closer to simply being. Before she lies down, there is one final small ritual worth mentioning, because it connects to the broader religious texture of daily Athenian life that ran underneath everything we've discussed tonight. A small offering, perhaps a few grains of incense or a small libation of wine, made at the household shrine to Hestia, goddess of the hearth and home, a quiet acknowledgement of the household's protection through another day, performed, as it almost always was, by the woman of the house rather than the man, since the hearth, the literal and symbolic center of domestic life, fell so completely and naturally within the feminine domain that even the gods, it seems, expected to hear primarily from her. The oil lamp, a simple shallow ceramic vessel with a wick floating in olive oil, the same oil that formed the base of her perfumes and the foundation of so much of the household's economy, burns low now, casting the kind of soft, shifting amber light across the plaster walls that connects this room, this moment, directly to every other lamplit room we've spent time in across this whole long journey through history. The Victorian candle, the colonial tallow dip, all of them variations on the same basic human negotiation with darkness, the same careful calculation of how much light a household could actually afford to burn before economy demanded the flame finally be allowed to die. Melissa's lamp, like those others, represents real expense. Olive oil, while certainly more abundant and locally produced in Greece than in many other ancient societies, given the Mediterranean climate's deep ancient relationship with the olive tree, was nonetheless a valuable commodity, used for cooking, for the body oils we discussed earlier, for religious offerings, and for lighting, meaning that every hour a household burned lamps deep into the night represented oil that could otherwise have gone toward food, toward cosmetics, toward the temple offerings that Athenian religious life demanded with genuine regularity throughout the calendar year. So as the household finally settles into darkness, as Philon eventually makes his own way up from the Andron, his guests departed, the wine cups cleared away by slaves who will themselves not rest until the cleaning is finished, Melissa lies in the cool darkness of her own chamber, the same chamber where her day began so many hours earlier, and the city of Athens itself settles into the particular quality of ancient nighttime darkness we've discussed in other centuries, other stories. A darkness genuinely absolute by any modern standard, broken only by the occasional torch of a late traveller in the streets below, the distant bark of a dog, the settling creak of the house's wooden beams as the temperature drops through the night. I want to take a moment here, before we close, to step back from Melissa's particular story and think more broadly about what this entire day actually reveals. Because I think the temptation, when looking back at a civilization as celebrated and as foundational to so much of what came after it as classical Athens, is to focus almost entirely on its genuine, extraordinary achievements, the philosophy, the democracy, however limited and exclusionary that democracy actually was, the theatre, the architecture, the art, all of it justly celebrated across more than 2,000 years of Western cultural memory. But the democracy that Athens is so famous for, the genuine innovation of citizens gathering to vote directly on the laws and policies that governed their city, a system that, whatever its limitations, represented something genuinely new and influential in human political history, rested on a foundation that excluded, completely and without exception, every single woman in the entire city, regardless of her wealth, her family's status, her personal intelligence or capability. Melissa, despite managing a household economy that might rival a modest business, despite raising the very sons who would eventually exercise that celebrated citizenship right she herself would never possess, had no formal political voice whatsoever. Not one single vote, not one moment of formal participation in the political life so central to her own city's self-understanding and its enduring historical legacy. And the philosophy too, the genuinely extraordinary intellectual achievement of figures like Socrates, Plato, and later Aristotle, much of which survives to us specifically because it was recorded as having taken place in exactly the kind of symposium gathering happening tonight in Philon's Andron, developed within a social and intellectual world that by careful, deliberate design excluded respectable women entirely from direct participation. The Hutta Rai who might have attended such gatherings, who might have engaged directly in this intellectual exchange, occupied, as we discussed, a social position specifically defined by their exclusion from respectable citizen family life. The philosophy we still study and admire today, in other words, was produced within a deliberately gendered space, one that systematically denied women like Melissa, whatever native intelligence or curiosity she might genuinely have possessed, any meaningful opportunity to participate in or contribute to it directly. I don't say any of this to diminish the genuine, lasting achievement of Athenian civilization, the same way I wouldn't want to diminish the genuine technical achievement of a Victorian household's careful annual candle making, or the genuine resourcefulness of a colonial American family securing their livestock before nightfall. These things can be simultaneously true. Athens produced extraordinary foundational philosophy and political theory that genuinely shaped the entire subsequent trajectory of Western thought. And that same Athens built its entire social and intellectual architecture on a foundation that completely silenced, politically and intellectually, more than half of its own free population, while resting its material comfort on the labor of enslaved people who made up perhaps a quarter or more of everyone living within its walls. History, as I've found myself saying in other stories on other nights, is rarely simple enough to fit into a single clean verdict, either pure celebration or pure condemnation. The genuine wisdom embedded in Athenian democratic theory and the genuine cruelty embedded in its exclusion of women and its dependence on slavery existed simultaneously, in the same city, often within the very same households, sometimes, as we've seen tonight, within the very same hour. Philon discussing philosophy and justice with his friends in one room while his wife, denied any formal voice in either philosophy or justice, managed the household that made his evening of intellectual leisure possible in the first place. Let me offer you one more thread before we let this particular night close, because I think it deserves real attention, and it connects in a strange and genuinely moving way all the way forward to conversations happening in our own time. The architecture of seclusion we've spent tonight exploring, the gynakion, the careful separation of male and female household space, the elaborate social rules governing exactly when and how a respectable woman could appear in public. None of this was unique to Athens alone, and elements of it would echo forward across an enormous span of subsequent history into the Byzantine world, into various periods and regions of the broader Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, sometimes intensifying, sometimes loosening, but rarely disappearing entirely for many, many centuries. And there is something genuinely worth sitting with in recognizing that the particular shape of Melissa's constraint, the locked inner door, the careful management of who could see her and under what circumstances, the elaborate cosmetic and clothing rituals designed to communicate status and respectability simultaneously, finds genuine echoes, with all their own distinct cultural particulars and historical differences, in other times and places we've spent evenings exploring together. The specific mechanisms shift dramatically across history and across cultures. The underlying logic, the deep recurring human impulse to construct elaborate systems controlling and constraining female visibility, female mobility, female public voice, while simultaneously depending utterly on female domestic labor and reproductive capacity for the households and the society's continued functioning, that underlying logic appears with a consistency across so many different eras and civilizations that it genuinely deserves our sustained, careful attention rather than dismissal as simply an unfortunate quirk of one particular ancient society now safely behind us. I think, too, about what we don't know, what the historical record genuinely cannot tell us, because I want to be honest about the limits of tonight's story in the same way the better historical accounts I've studied are honest about their own limits. We have no surviving private letters from a woman like Melissa, No diary entries of the kind that gave us such vivid, intimate access to women's interior lives in some of those later centuries we've explored together. Almost everything we know about elite Athenian women's daily experience comes to us filtered through male authors, philosophers constructing idealized models of household management, playwrights creating female characters for dramatic and often satirical purposes, legal texts establishing the formal boundaries of female legal status, vase paintings depicting idealized scenes of women at the loom or preparing for festivals, funerary monuments recording, in carefully formulaic language, the praised virtues of deceased wives and mothers. This means that Melissa herself, the actual texture of her private thoughts, her genuine feelings about the marriage she never chose, about the children she lost, about the long hours at the loom, about whatever small private joys or quiet resentments filled her actual interior life, remains, in the most honest and complete sense, genuinely unknowable to us. We can reconstruct, with reasonable historical confidence, the external architecture of her existence, the laws, the customs, the economic realities, the religious obligations. The woman herself, in her full human particularity, slips through the historical record almost entirely, present everywhere in the structures built around her, and yet almost nowhere in her own recorded voice. I find that absence, when I sit with it honestly, genuinely moving in its own particular way, and it connects, I think, to something worth carrying forward from this entire long evening together. The women whose lives we've spent tonight exploring, real, historical, ordinary women living within an extraordinary and extraordinarily constrained civilization, left behind almost no direct trace of their own individual voices, their own particular griefs and small satisfactions, even as the civilization built so substantially upon their invisible labor produced some of the most celebrated and carefully preserved written records in all of human history. The philosophy survives, the political theory survives, the poetry, the plays, the legal codes, all of it survives, meticulously copied and recopied across more than 2 millennia. And the actual woman managing the household that made all of that intellectual production materially possible disappears almost entirely from the record she herself helped sustain. So tonight, as we let Melissa finally drift towards sleep in her cool, dark chamber, the lamp finally extinguished, the household settling into the particular silence of an ancient Athenian night, the same kind of profound, star-filled darkness we've encountered in other centuries, other stories, broken only by the occasional distant sound of the city beyond her walls. I want to offer something small, something I think is worth carrying with you as you yourself drift toward your own rest tonight. The women who lived inside structures like the ones we've explored together this evening were not simply passive victims of a system entirely beyond their control, even though that system genuinely was, in fundamental and often devastating ways, beyond their control. They were also, within the narrow space the system allowed them, skilled household managers, careful mothers, genuine friends to other women, keepers of religious traditions that connected their entire community to forces and mysteries far larger than any individual life, producers of real, valuable, beautiful work through their own patient hands at the loom. Thank you for spending this evening with me, walking through those courtyard walls and back out again. If something in tonight's story stayed with you, a detail that surprised you, a number that startled you, a moment that made you feel something you didn't expect to feel about a woman who lived 2,400 years ago, I'd genuinely love to know. Sleep well, wherever you are, whatever time it is for you right now. The lamp is going out. The house has gone quiet. Good night.